Get that bastard down here.
Okay, I love her again.
Rand screamed upon hearing the news, or I'll drag him here myself.
I'm back on board.
It's finished, your whole act, she told him. I'll tear down your facade as I built it up. I'll denounce you publicly. I'll destroy you as I created you. I don't even care what it does to me. You won't have the career I gave you, or the name, or the wealth, or the prestige. You'll have nothing. The barrage continued on for several minutes until she pronounced her final curse. If you have an ounce of morality left in you, an ounce of psychological health, you'll be impotent for the next 20 years. In progress.
Yeah, I'm a Zoom.
Hello, Kayla.
Hi.
Hi, it's Chris.
It's Kayla.
Cool.
I didn't know we were starting.
Well, I don't know. We always because we haven't done banter in a while. Let's figure out. Do you want to do banter this time?
I don't know how to banter.
I don't really know how to banter either.
What are you up to these days?
Playing Zelda.
Same.
With you. Working on this podcast quite a bit.
Same.
So there's that. Helping you strike.
Same.
Okay. All right. Cool
Great banter.
That was good banter.
Yeah.
Jokey Jokerson. Fine. Let's get to it. It's another biggie, which I know is maybe unexpected since we're breaking this up into 3, but I just have a problem. So what are you going to do?
And that problem is called objectivism.
Yeah, that was okay. So I have multiple problems. That's one of them.
Well, first of all, welcome to Culture Just Weird.
Welcome to Culture Just Weird.
I'm Kayla. I'm a television writer.
I am Chris. I am game designer / data scientist.
And this is our podcast.
It is. It's our podcast where we cast pods and get on soapboxes. Before we get into it today, we have normal business. We have our regularly scheduled business, which is we gotta thank our new patrons. We have 2 new patrons.
Oh my God.
So big thank you to Tessa Hamilton and Noelle Hoover. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for supporting us on Patreon. It was a good time to join, actually, because we finally did the thing that we said we were going to do. We said we were going to do it last episode. We also said we were going to do it the entirety of this podcast, all 5 seasons.
Yeah.
Where we argue with each other about capitalism.
We finally did Is Capitalism a Cult, you guys. I know it's supposed to be a bonus episode, and it's like an hour and a half
It's
long.
like a regular episode.
Yeah.
So it's probably a good thing we didn't talk about it on the main feed, because it was already a long episode.
Go check it out on our Patreon.
So other than mentioning that we finally decided whether capitalism was a cult or not.
Oh, and we reached a decision, you guys.
We did reach a decision, but we're not going to spoil it because that's behind the paywall, you know?
That's what Patreon's for, baby. Patreon.com/culturejustweird.
So before we get into the topic today, the topic for this episode, I do want to talk a little bit about some things that have been on my mind.
Okay.
Since doing the last episode.
All right.
Some things where I was like, oh, I wish I had said this, or oh, I just thought of this based on what we talked about, and I kind of wrote them down, and then I stuck them in my script.
Okay.
So I have a list of things I thought of over the past couple weeks. So last episode, just to recap, we talked about like the beliefs of objectivism and sort of like went into a little bit of like the broader philosophy, the philosophical framework that they fall under. I didn't talk too much about the books that Ayn Rand wrote. We will talk a little bit more about that today. But one of the things that I did want to say is that The Fountainhead, her first like real novel, first successful novel, it was the first time that I was really exposed to the idea that something entirely secular could be spiritual or produce a spiritual experience.
Because it's so much about the experience of art.
Right, exactly. And before that, like my perception was that like it was either traditional religion or something, you know, outside the norm, but still supernatural, like a new age spirituality thing. I thought that sort of had like the monopoly on spiritual experiences, but
you hadn't been introduced to the idea of like secular spirituality.
Right. And The Fountainhead sort of introduced me to that idea, gave me sort of like an alternative to that idea. that we can have awe and reverence and a spiritual experience based on things that are entirely grounded in reality. Like, you know, not to sound cliche, but like the vastness of the universe or the unknowability of the universe, or I don't know, some art, you know, some art produces that feeling. Some art. If you watch an art, sometimes if you watch an art, it makes you get that feeling. But true though, sometimes, you know, you look at a piece of art or you watch a television show or whatever, and it just gives you that like, holy shit, there are some beautiful, crazy things out there. Whatever that spiritual feeling is that we don't have a great word for other than spiritual, I guess.
Right.
So wanted to mention that, maybe put that in the pro column. One of the things that I forgot to bring up when we were talking about the tiers of
the kingdom,
which is the game that I'm playing right now. But no, the TIERS, the philosophical tiers. So there's metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, and then politics. One of the ways that was helpful for me, and again, Ayn Rand didn't necessarily like invent the idea of, you know, those tiers, but it was the first time I was exposed to it. And one of the ways that it's helpful for me is that if you're like having an argument with somebody, it's actually useful to know like what tier that argument is happening on.
Okay.
Right. So like, let's say intelligent design or something like that. Right. Like if somebody is having that argument based on a more like they're coming from it in like a creationism, you know, they believe in the Bible, and therefore there's this like metaphysical disagreement you have about whether the universe simply exists or whether there was a God that created it.
Right.
That's at a lower level than just like the content of like, well, here are some specific things about creationism, right? You're not going to like, that's why frequently it doesn't surprise me that no matter how many like details and facts we talk about with each other on certain topics, it's not going to change somebody's mind. Right. Right. Like no matter how many facts and whatever I show someone, if they already believe in God and the primacy of God having created the universe, yada, yada, then I know that it's just sort of like a waste of time to talk about the like, you know, the science of it.
It doesn't matter how many facts and figures you come at me with. I refuse to change my stance that 0 and infinity are the same thing. Oh my God. So yes, I understand this as well.
Yeah, exactly. So you have your own little pet supernatural stuff that you think about. You know, if you just said related instead of same thing.
No, they're exactly the same thing. Anyway. I have some YouTube videos to show you.
Oh, great. Yeah, no, you have like some actual cult YouTube videos. Please don't share that with anyone. So I find that helpful. Or like even like the virtue of capitalism, right? Like it's easier to talk about like whether that's right or wrong if you have like some sort of same base to start from. Like you at least, well, okay, we agree that existence exists and we agree that reason is important, but we don't agree whether capitalism is good or not, or which aspects of it are good or not. I think it's maybe easier to have that discussion, or it should be easier to have that discussion. You know, with objectivists, frequently it isn't, which I think is part of the problem.
Are you saying they're hard to have conversations with? Or hard to have disagreements with?
Well, yes and no. Like individual objectivists I've met.
I've got a big question here.
Are pretty reasonable, but objectivism as a whole, if you like, when you're talking about like ARI and like the official stance, yeah, no disagreement.
This sounds like a lot of work. Like, why do they care?
Well, we'll get to that a little bit.
But like, what's the deal?
Well, yeah.
Aren't they tired?
I think so. I'm tired. Tired just talking about this stuff.
It's just having a stance on anything is really hard and draining. Yeah. And then to have a stance on like metaphysics, epistemology,
on everything. We will get to this.
And what was the last one?
Art. But,
ethics and art?
Oh, sorry. Ethics, then politics.
Ethics, then politics?
Art and other things.
That's just a lot of work.
I know. No, it is. It's been described as a complete philosophical framework, and I think by complete they mean like they have an opinion about everything.
As part of this complete breakfast?
Yeah, as part of this complete breakfast. We will get to all of that actually. But I did want to talk about how the philosophical tier thing kind of helps me know whether it's like worth my time to discuss something with someone. Like if we can't agree on some like basic metaphysical stuff, it doesn't matter whether we're going to agree on the details beyond that. The other thing I wanted to mention.
It's a really big statement. I won't get into it, but that is a really big statement.
Oh, do you have a potential disagreement?
No, I don't. I guess my great disagreement is not that. It's like, is that a reason then to figure out how to have common ground finding conversations with those people. Obviously not in all circumstances, but...
Oh, yeah, you're right. This is a can of worms, isn't it?
Yeah. That's why I shouldn't even have said anything.
Stuff the lid back on the worms. They're getting out. It's okay. We'll talk about it later. Moving on. The law of identity is something we talked about in last episode. And that's the thing where it's like, A is A. A thing is what it is. A thing can't be something else that is different than it at the same time and in the same regard, is kind of like how that law is stated.
Right.
And then we talked a little bit about like, okay, but is it dangerous to like take that, well, like a thing is what it is, and extend it out further down than just like the metaphysical layer?
Right.
And of course, the way that came up was like, a man is a man and a woman's a woman.
Right.
Right. And how that can be dangerous. And one of the things that
it's hard to apply any sort of binary to human beings because we're wild and crazy. We are wild and crazy out here.
Yeah. And that's kind of what we mentioned last episode. And I agree that like binary versus spectrum is definitely like a fallacy and one that I think objectivism gets into a lot. But I also thought of over the past few weeks that like the law of identity also doesn't, that in this respect, the law of identity it's not like monopolized either by bigots. Right. Like a trans person could very easily say, yes, a woman is a woman, and that's what I am.
Right.
I am a woman. I know that it is what it is, and that is what me is.
Right. Me is.
Yeah. So I just wanted to mention that was like another angle on that I hadn't thought of until after the show. And then the only other business I want to talk about, it's not really business. It's maybe just like a little bit of like hey, this is sort of related to what we're talking about. And this is something you and I talk about on the couch all the time. God. You don't seem to think it's very cool. I don't know. I do.
What?
Mary's room.
I'm just upset about it. I'm just sick of it.
You just don't think that Mary's room is like a big deal.
I don't even know why. I don't even even remember anymore. I gotta have a take on everything.
You do. Well, it's, we're of the internet age, so you gotta have a take on everything. I'm just gonna read you the experiment as it was originally, the thought experiment,
I'm so sick of this one.
The thought experiment. Well, you know what? Some of our listeners maybe haven't heard what Mary's room is, so I'm going to say it for them.
Nah, that's cool.
Thought experiment, originally proposed by Frank Jackson as follows. Mary is a brilliant scientist who is, for whatever reason, forced to investigate the world from a black and white room via a black and white television monitor. She specializes in the neurophysiology of vision and acquires all of the physical information there is to obtain about what goes on when we see ripe tomatoes or the sky, and she uses terms like red and blue and so on. She discovers, for example, just which wavelength combinations from the sky stimulate the retina and exactly how this produces via the central nervous system the contraction of the vocal cords and expulsion of air from the lungs that results in the uttering of the sentence, "The sky is blue." What happens when Mary is released from her black and white room or is given a color television monitor? Does she learn anything new or not?
Look, okay. I just don't see how it's shocking to come to the conclusion of yes, obviously. And I think what irks me about Mary's room relates back to this like common refrain that you will see on the internet sometimes. And hear me out and then let me do my explanation.
Must I?
So this common refrain that I'm referring to says something like, some men will have transformative drug trips in their 20s and 30s and come to realizations that girls had when they were 14 at a slumber party. And what I take that to mean...
what are you guys doing at your slumber parties?
We are having conversations. What I take that to mean is that some people in our society are set up to be forced to truly experience empathizing with somebody else's perspective. And some people in our society are not forced to do that until maybe later in life or have to come to that realization themselves.
Okay.
Most somewhat marginalized groups are forced as a survival mechanism to be able to understand the POV of like dominant groups. So like women are forced to understand the perspective of men. Black people are forced to understand the perspective of white people because white men traditionally are the heroes of our stories, are shaping our stories, yada, yada, yada.
Okay.
And so I just don't think
how are you going to land this plane?
I don't think it is that controversial to large swaths of the population to say, well, yeah, of course Mary experiences something different if she sees that the sky is actually blue. Of course you learn something different when you actually experience it yourself. What does that have to do with somebody else's POV, though? Because you've come to that realization that, like, oh, other people have a different perspective that is entirely informed by their experience that I don't have access to necessarily.
Well, the formulation of Mary's room doesn't even involve other people, right? Like, the formulation of Mary's room is
I understand.
Is more about, like, even if nobody else in the universe exists, does she learn something new? Like, she doesn't even, I think, have to have the thought that somebody else saw something differently than her eyeballs.
I'm not saying that Mary has that experience. I'm saying that it doesn't, I guess I don't understand why it's like a philosophical question. It's like, of course she learned something new.
Because I think it goes a little deeper than, like, just POVs and perspective and walking in somebody else's shoes.
Okay.
The core thrust of this is, and the reason I bring it up in this episode is, can you actually learn any truth you need to learn via reason alone? Or and this is where the word qualia comes in, and I don't want to, like, go into all this too much, but qualia is like, is there an aspect of this entity, of this thing, or of this experience that cannot be described in any formal way whatsoever, that I can only gain some sort of knowledge about it experientially? And what that implies is, since she's read every single thing that can possibly be read about red, blue, green, yellow,
right,
that means that thing cannot be put into words, because if it was put into words, she would have already read it, because she's a brilliant brain scientist for 30 years in the black and white room.
Yeah.
You don't find that interesting, that there might be an idea that there's experiences and knowledge that literally cannot be formulated into words?
Yes, I do find that interesting. What I don't find interesting is the question. I think that maybe that's all it is. You can do your whole Mary's room, but then don't end it with a, does she learn? Yes, of course she learned something new. Of course. But
that's the question, right?
No, it's not a question.
Yes, it is, because if the answer is yes, then that means you are saying that there is something that she experienced that could not be put into words, no matter how hard you try.
Yes, I
think that's actually a pretty significant statement, Kayla.
I know, but the statement is already made. But now we're getting into the semantics. The statement is already made by everything you say before you ask the question. The statement's already been made, so then I just don't understand where the question's there.
Okay, well,
the experiment
like it,
sets up the yes answer.
I don't think that is, to me, that is not at all obvious. Okay. That being said,
you never went to a slumber party when you were a 14-year-old girl.
Right. So I've never been to 14-year-old girl slumber parties, and it's probably too late for that now. But I do think that it is an interesting thought experiment to talk about in context of objectivism, because I believe an objectivist might say to that, the answer is actually no.
Well, an objectivist would be wrong.
Objectively wrong?
Has an objectivist never gone like, whoa, what if when you look at the color
Kayla,
red,
I really think
you're seeing the color blue, how I
really think that you're kind of being dogmatic about this.
But you look at it and you see, will never know if we see the colors the same. I feel like
you're in your own Mary's room about Mary's room.
Potentially. No, but you know what I'm saying? Like, has an objectivist never had that conversation of thinking,
I'm sure they have.
Well, what if...
But the question isn't, have they thought about these things? The question is, can you learn everything you need to know via pure reason?
No.
Or not?
Wait, hold on. Can you learn everything you need to know?
Can you learn everything there is to know?
No. The answer is absolutely not.
Okay, well, that is Kayla's official position.
My official position.
I think we should say, I'm a little short saying it's the podcast official position, but I find the question
So you don't think there's something...
We should probably get to the episode.
You don't think that qualia exists only experientially?
No, that's the definition of qualia. The question that I'm not sure about is that real? And
you're saying you're not sure if that's real?
Yeah, I'm not sure if that is a real thing or not. I'm not it feels real, but like, I don't know. Like, nobody's ever put a brilliant scientist in a room for 30 years with only black and white television. So Mary herself might come out and be like, no, I don't think I really learned anything new. Like, it's cool that I saw the color blue, but it didn't really teach me anything.
I think you and Mary need to go take a hike.
Well, I think that we need to continue with the episode.
You're the one who brought it up.
Let's recap. This episode is part 2 of 3. So if you really want to catch up, go listen to our previous episode. Listen to that first. Or don't. I don't give a fuck. Whatever. This will be cool anyway. But to recap that episode, we talked about objectivist beliefs and more generally philosophical tiers, the ones we were just talking about a minute ago. Speaking of last episode, Kayla, when we got into it, I asked you about how much you feel like your personal values and beliefs have evolved in the last 15 or so years. And we talked a little bit about how and why. Now, instead of asking you about how your personal feelings have changed and evolved, I want to ask you if you have any people for whom your feelings have changed and evolved.
Oh,
and this could be people in your personal life, but I imagine this conversation is going to include maybe some like role models, like mentors, heroes, artists you admire, etc.
Look, I went back and forth so many times. I have snipped on Kim Kardashian. So, yes, obviously.
Wait, what was that?
Snip, snap, snip.
No, what was... What were you doing? What is that?
Oh, boy.
Are we keeping this? I have no idea.
I don't know. Yes. I mean, how much do you want me to get into this? Obviously not the Kardashian thing, but how many people do you want me to tell you that I've changed my opinion on?
I want you to list them all in alphabetical order.
And in the last 15 years?
Just a few people. Look, we're just trying to get the idea that you...
Any female who was present in pop culture in 2003.
Right. We all shit on them then, and now we're kind of coming to terms with that. Is that what you're talking about?
Pam Anderson, Britney Spears, Christina Aguilera, Paris Hilton, like Jessica Simpson, you name it, we're there.
Yeah.
Kim Kardashian, I've gone snip, snap, nip on. I was like, boo, Kim K. Then I was like, yay, Kim K. And
now you're boo again?
Very, very boo.
Speaking of Kim K, I assume that Kanye's on the list.
Kanye was on the list. I was boo, yay, and then very boo.
Yeah. It was like boo at first because it was like, man, shut up about Hurricane Katrina like that. And shut up about like Taylor Swift. But your music is awesome.
And then it was like, hell yeah, you were right about Hurricane Katrina.
Yeah. And then like in the last couple of years, it's been like, oh shit.
Oh, you have some
oh my God.
views that I do not want to be anywhere near. And there's plenty of people like that aren't, not just celebrities, but I'm sure I could name you a handful of politicians. I'm sure I could name you a handful of thought leaders, quote unquote. I'm sure I could name you a handful of writers. Yes, of course, there are many people who I have changed my opinion on. Especially now we've gotten a lot more knowledge about various people. With things like the internet, we have more access to the inner lives of our celebrities, and there's a lot that comes with that. Yeah,
Twitter is like basically, I've heard this. Twitter is described as like we handed every celebrity like a loaded gun, and we're like, here you go, and then like a bunch of them were like, cool, I'm going to shoot myself with this.
Yeah.
So
reputationally,
reputationally, yeah. So I mean, this is something that we're all sort of dealing with lately. We've talked about it on the show, certainly. We just talked about Louis C.K., I think, last episode or last bonus episode. And of course, in case this wasn't painfully obvious, I ask you this because today we're talking about the charismatic leader who created the objectivist belief system, Ayn Rand. And as we already hinted at many times in the previous episode, she is an extremely mixed bag, both in terms of the things that she well and truly believes. Some of those beliefs are cool and some are more of a drag. And also in terms of whether she actually walks the walk on the things that maybe she does believe, which is also a mixed bag.
This is the stuff I know a little bit more about.
Oh, you already know the juicy stuff? Oh, well,
I don't necessarily know the like horrendous things that she has said.
This is the juicy stuff.
That potentially like outweigh the good things that she said, but I definitely know like certain things that she did in her life in the later years.
Okay. But what would a charismatic leader be without having some of their influence over other human beings go to their head? Am I right?
Happens to the worst of us and the best of us.
Of course. Nobody starts out charismatic, influential, or hubristic.
Excuse you, I've read the Bible.
Who starts out charismatic in the Bible?
Jesus Christ, baby.
I guess he pops out and like
he pops out and people are showing up, giving him gifts.
Yeah, you're right. Well, as charismatic as he maybe started out life, Ayn Rand probably started out with a little bit of hubris, at least, too. But what she wasn't born with was the name Ayn Rand. She was born Alyssa Rosenbaum on February 2nd, 1905 in St. Petersburg, Russia, which, yes, it was still called St. Petersburg back in 1905. Her family, she also had two sisters, by the way.
And their names were Bine and Dine.
Yeah, Ayn Rand, Bine Rand, and Dine Rand. Yep. Wouldn't it be Kine Rand?
Yeah.
ABC?
Keanu
Rand? No, I don't know what their names were, and I'm not willing to look it up right now. But they were considered a bourgeois class family. So her parents owned a pharmacy, and they did pretty well until she was 12 years old. So her 12th birthday happened in 1917.
That's an important year.
Yep, that was a pretty important year in Russian history. That was the year that the Bolsheviks took control of the Russian Soviet government. And as a consequence, many businesses were nationalized, including the Rosenbaum's pharmacy. They fled St. Petersburg, now Petrograd, to another city in Russia. Let's see if I pronounce this correctly. Yevpatoria, I think. That city was under White Army control, which White Army was like the anti-Bolsheviks. But eventually they did have to move back to Petrograd. Alyssa attended high school during their time in Yevpatoria. And then when they got back to Petrograd, she enrolled in university. I think it was the University of Petrograd, where she studied philosophy and history. This is where she picked up her love of Aristotle, supposedly. So that's where that comes from. Life was indeed hard for her family during this time. Reportedly, they were near starving several times. She and others, considered bourgeois class students.
Is that how it's pronounced?
Bourgeois? Bourgeois? Should I say bourgeois? Am I saying bourgeois?
I'm saying bourgeois. I don't know how it's pronounced.
Bourgeois. So, yeah, I think you're right. I think I've been pronouncing it stupidly.
Bourgeois.
Other students of that class faced a purge from her university, although they were eventually reinstated after some visiting foreigners protested.
Jeez.
So, just a quick note here. Objectivists don't really like to admit that, like, nature or nurture is a thing. Like, they're very...
Wait, what do you mean?
Like whenever they're faced with a question, or not whenever, I shouldn't say whenever, but several times I have seen when they're faced with this question of like, well, do you think it's nature or nurture more? They're like, well, what about like individual choice? Like they always just sort of like barrel through that and say like, well, a lot of people have been grown up in this yada yada, but you know, they didn't do well and I did do well. So, or this person didn't, you know, this person emigrated from blah, blah, blah. And so did Andrew Carnegie or whatever. So like they like to sort of like,
oh, they're saying it doesn't matter, just like...
Kind of.
Okay.
Yeah. They're kind of saying that, like...
Well, that's interesting that
it's a collectivist fallacy to talk about nature versus nurture when it's all about individual choice.
That's so interesting because you said things that, like, they recognize some systemic issues, like police brutality or whatever, or systemic racism.
Yeah.
But then, I guess, choose when not to think about the systems at play in individuals' lives. I think
it's just one of those things. I think that like when an objectivist is having like a normal conversation about things like about systemic issues and about like things you can actually study and point to. I think where it gets a little weird is when you get into like the ideological part about, you know, like when you get into the very theory crafty land about nature versus nurture, right? Like if you can actually sit here and point to like, oh yeah, redlining, that is documented.
Okay.
There's evidence for that, right? Whereas with nature versus nurture, like it's much more nebulous, right? So I think it's easier for them to say like, well, not, you know, it's not nature or nurture, it's individual choice. The reason I bring it up here is because like, while I think that there is maybe some merit to the fact that like individual choice is certainly something that matters, it just doesn't, to me, it's not incompatible at all with the notion of nature or nurture. And it feels like it shouldn't be incompatible with the way Ayn Rand feels about it too, because the way that she seems to feel about it is things happen to you and then you sort of like incorporate those ideas and experiences, and then that in turn generates your decision-making apparatus about these things, which I think is roughly how neuroscientists think of it, roughly.
It doesn't seem like they deny the fact that, like, influence exists, but then to go, like, no nature, nurture, individual choice.
Right. It feels like they kind of cherry pick a little bit there.
Also, like, is nature or nurture even, like, a thing? Like, what does that mean? Do they even talk about that in real science? Like, is that just, like, a thing that dinguses like you and me talk about?
I think it's a dingus thing, but what do you mean real Okay, hold on. Let's not go down this tangent.
I'm just saying, if I sit here and get all indignant about how objectivists feel about nature versus nurture, is that even a useful, like, way to spend my time
I think
if
that's
nature or nurture is not like, okay.
Yeah, I think it's like a framework for debate, not like a studied phenomenon. And I think if you were to study it, it would be like from a sociological perspective.
Copy that.
The reason I bring it up, though, is because like you can look at Ayn Rand's early childhood and go like, oh, okay, yeah, that's why she cares about that stuff.
Right.
Right. Like you can look at the fact that her family's business was nationalized and the fact that they were like a bourgeois class family that lost everything thanks to the Soviet government and go like, okay, that makes sense that she would hate that a lot.
Right.
And like, the fact that she starved almost and like had that, purge, the student purge in her university, like kind of points all to the like, I do get that. So there's a lot of nurture in there.
Right.
A lot of it is also her decisions because there's other people that had their businesses nationalized and didn't do what Ayn Rand did. So you can definitely point to that. But there's also clearly like she was influenced by her early childhood there.
Right.
So she emigrated to the United States in 1926 on pretext of enriching the Soviet film industry, although she had no intention of ever returning. Her first stop was Chicago, briefly, and one of her first acts was to change her name to Ayn Rand.
Where did that come from?
So that's her actual name, not a pen name, and that came from, I didn't write it down, but I meant to. So her pen name, okay, so first of all, I've seen it as like she actually changed her name, and I've seen it as pen name. I think she actually changed her name, though. So Rand, according to her, was taken from the Russian alphabet spelling of Rosenbaum, her actual last name. So that was derived from her last name. And she said she chose Ayn after the name of a writer she liked from Finland, a Finnish writer. I don't know who. I have not seen who, but someone she liked named Ayn.
I wish there was more info.
I know. There might be. I just didn't dig too deeply on like the name change thing.
Right.
I also saw something suggesting that like maybe she did that to like protect her family back in Russia.
Okay.
But anyway, she was in the United States by 1926, changed her name to Ayn Rand. She was only in Chicago for a few months before moving to Hollywood to become a screenwriter.
Hey.
She actually met Cecil B. DeMille by lucky accident, and he gave her opportunities as an extra and eventually as a screenwriter.
Isn't that how it used to work in the old days? You could just roll up to Hollywood and
meet,
run into
like,
someone.
the most famous person.
And then they're like, I like the cut of your jib.
Yep.
You should be in the pictures.
You have a face for pictures. Yeah, apparently. But bootstraps, though, Kayla. She didn't get any help from
there was
anyone.
no luck involved.
There was no luck involved, and she did everything on her own. 3 years after emigrating, she married actor Frank O'Connor. And 2 years after that, she became an American citizen. If you're keeping track at home, that puts us at 1931. In 1933, she wrote her first successful play, a Broadway play, entitled Night of January the 16th. I think it's like a courtroom drama.
Compelling.
Yeah. Which essentially is like what The Fountainhead amounts to being anyway. So she and her husband, Frank, then moved to New York City so she could oversee production of this play. And in the next several years, she wrote her first two literature works, We the Living and Anthem, which both were about the evils of collectivist totalitarian states. And I think both were like dystopian setting. Like one was like future dystopia and one was like actual Soviet setting, I think.
Okay.
And I think it was Anthem where part of the setting was that like the word I had been eliminated from the English language. So that was fun. But, it's whatever. Like, people write in sci-fi. Yeah. Sometimes they do weird stuff. It's not that cringe. So these two novels did okay. And I'd certainly say that having written a Broadway play counts squarely as success, right?
Sure.
But her first mass market pop culture, this is why you've heard of this person's success, was a novel we've mentioned several times already, The Fountainhead. The Fountainhead was published in 1943. And it tells the story of Howard Roark, sort of like a Dr. House of architecture. So he's like brilliant, egotistical, but not exactly like personable. Although I will say like 99% of the time, Roark is merely unpersonal because he just like kind of doesn't care.
Yeah, I was going to say, I don't think the Dr. House comparison is accurate, honestly, because Dr. House says things to be mean.
Right.
And Howard Rourke. It's that whole meme of like, I don't think of you at all. Doesn't he say that in the book?
He does, actually, yeah.
It's not that he's pointedly mean to anyone. Yeah. It's that he simply he does not think of others. He thinks of himself in his heart.
Right. He's truthful when he says that, when he says, I don't think of you at all. And I think,
oh my God, I'm sorry.
And you're right. The house.
I know I've said it, but I'm going to say here, I really loved that book. I really liked that book a lot.
Yeah. There's a lot to like about it. There's a lot that's like inspirational about it.
That whole thing of, I don't think of you at all, to say to like somebody who thinks they're your nemesis, to say that and mean it.
It is the ultimate dunk. Yeah.
Oh, it is
and
the ultimate dunk. Like, and then just
but if you really mean it, it's like not even a dunk.
But it's
right. It's like only a dunk to them.
Oh my
which is
God.
like I think makes it better.
Yeah, it's.
Yeah, that was probably like one of like the 2 or 3 things in that book where it like really hooked me.
Yeah, and there's lots that we can sit here and like say, well, this is wrong and that's wrong, and like I don't care for its depiction of rape, and I don't care for this, that, and the other.
We'll get to that.
But oh man, I really liked that book.
Yeah, so just for context, what happens is like the villain character who's just like this smart is like he's like a banality of evil type villain, right?
He's Pete from Mad Men.
Yeah, he's Pete from Mad Men, right? And he finally finds Rourke, who is trying to like
not even Don Draper. He's better than Don Draper,
right? And he says like, well, I'm really quite curious, like, what do you really deep down? What do you actually think of me, Howard? And he says, I don't think of you.
Oh my God.
So good.
It's so good.
So like 99% of the time, Rourke is, I would say, not such a piece of shit like Dr. House. But the other 1% of the time is where he is a rapist, maybe, probably. So it kind of balances out.
No, he's
right?
explicit. I mean, that's the thing. It's like the initial intercourse that occurs between Howard Rourke and what's her name?
Dominique Francone.
And Dominique Franco?
Francone. Or maybe Francon. I don't know. Bourgeois. I can't pronounce things.
And Dominique Francone is explicitly referred to as rape.
It is, but it's also contested. I want to read you something from Wikipedia.
Dominique Francone calls it rape to herself. And yes, she's saying it in a way that is like, oh my gosh, I just got raped.
Right.
The R word is explicitly used. And and the use is also alongside her also explicitly having invited and enjoyed the encounter. So there's nuance and there's conflict and there's a lot going on in the scene, but
right. Well,
that word is used.
It's sort of a famously like to use the best possible word, famously controversial scene in the book. I would say maybe for me and maybe for others that are more towards like my side of thinking, it doesn't feel as controversial as it feels like kind of icky. Especially because it's like the protagonist and what is she trying to say with how the protagonist first has a sexual encounter with his female other. But anyway, I want to read this bit from the Wikipedia article on the Fountainhead because it gives a lot of interesting context. Quote, feminist critics have condemned Rourke's and Dominique's first sexual encounter, accusing Rand of endorsing rape. This was one of the most controversial elements of the book. Feminist critics have attacked the scene as representative of an anti-feminist viewpoint in Rand's works that makes women subservient to men. A side note from me, Chris, can confirm.
It's pretty clear.
There are other things that Rand has said that like 100% corroborate that viewpoint, that she had a pretty misogynistic outlook.
You can have quote unquote strong female characters, which Ayn Rand clearly does, and still have a philosophical stance that is anti-feminist.
Right, which is absolutely the case with her. Continuing the quote, Susan Brown Miller in her 1975 work, Against Our Will, Men, Women, and Rape, denounced what she called Rand's philosophy of rape for portraying women as wanting, quote, humiliation at the hands of a superior man, unquote. I think that quote is from Susan, not from Ayn Rand. I don't know if she would have said humiliation. Certainly that's what happened in this scene. But I think that she definitely had the flavor of superior man throughout her beliefs.
The whole thing in that scene is that the reason why Dominique enjoys it is because she's like, oh my gosh, I am so sexually turned on by a man who will just take what he wants without any concern for the other. Like that is peak man Rand. Right there. And then she as a character basically then like supports him through the rest of the book. Like, is a supportive force in the rest of the book.
Yeah, and it may also be worth noting that their relationship is weird. Like,
Right.
like she's not supportive of him. Her support of him is this weird sort of like destructive support. So like that kind of plays into
Right.
it too. Like her thing is like she doesn't think that the world, she's kind of nihilist about it. Like she doesn't
Right.
think that the world deserves his artistic genius.
Right.
So she tries to like take him down too, but like it's very dramatic.
Yeah.
But like
Look, I really love this book, and I don't think that, I'm not going to sit here and say like artists shouldn't write or create art about controversial things, and you get to have controversial stances. It's just, as you were discussing, like this particular scene is often talked about when this book is talked about.
Yeah, it's a challenging scene for sure.
And I think it's challenging even in Ayn Rand's own philosophies.
Yes.
I don't think that the hard work that she writes and the hard work that is to represent her objectivist philosophies, this act that he chooses to do does not really feel compatible with how he is and acts as a character.
Yeah.
He's not really into
he's not into other people.
dominating and
Yeah.
subjugating
Yeah.
others for his own will. He's just into making his buildings.
Right. So I agree that it feels weirdly actually out of character for him. It doesn't feel out of character for Rand, but again,
Sure.
I think that that's because she has this sort of like, I don't want to use the wrong words here, but like she sort of has this fetish for like subservience and dominant, and like she has this.
Well, she has a clear view that
this
women
clear
are
view that like the
beneath men.
ideal man is like a big deal for
Yeah.
her. Like the ideal man is like this shining example, and like
she means man explicitly.
man explicitly, and like women are defined to her like by their relationship to like the ideal woman is someone who like supports the ideal man, like that kind of thing.
Sure.
So I'll continue with this quote. Susan Love Brown said the scene presents Rand's view of sex as sadomasochism involving feminine subordination and passivity. Another writer, Barbara Harrison, suggested women who enjoy such masochistic fantasies are damaged and have low self-esteem.
See, these we're getting into some territory here.
Right,
that
I know.
is also controversial.
That's why I'm reading all of this, yeah.
Some of these statements are a little broad.
While Mimi Gladstein found elements to admire in Rand's female protagonists, she said that readers who have, quote, a raised consciousness about the nature of rape, end quote, would disapprove of Rand's romanticized rapes. Rand, for her part, posthumously published working notes for the novel that indicate that when she started on the book in 1936, she conceived of Rourke's character that, were it necessary, quote, this is a quote from her notes, were it necessary, he could rape her and feel justified, end quote. She denied that what happened in the finished novel was actually rape, referring to it as, quote, raped by engraved invitation, end quote.
Because, yeah, the whole way the
Not
scene
the
is
best
set
way
up
of putting it, but
is,
yes.
Oh, Dominique is like enticing him, and then he comes in and has sex with her against
Yeah,
her
so
will, but she wanted it.
She invites him into her house, but like on the pretext of like fixing some like marble
Right.
fireplace or something. And then she does the like, I think she like, dressed that way type of thing too. Like I think she, like not to say that, but like I think
But that's the
what's portrayed.
implication. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's not the most...
It's problematic.
yeah.
Rand said Dominique wanted and all but invited the act, citing, among other things, a passage where Dominique scratches a marble... Oh, this is what we just talked about. Scratches a marble slab in her bedroom. Oh, it's in her bedroom. Okay. To invite Rourke to repair it. So she intentionally scratches it so she can invite him to her bedroom. A true rape, Rand said, would be a quote-unquote dreadful crime. Defenders of the novel have agreed with this interpretation. In an essay specifically explaining the scene, Andrew Bernstein wrote that although much confusion exists about it, the descriptions in the novel provide conclusive evidence of Dominique's strong attraction to Rourke and her desire to have sex with him.
Yes, I agree. And I think that if simply Dominique had not used the word rape to herself, it would greatly change the conversations around this scene, because then it's just an empowered woman being like, I want to have sex with that guy,
and so I'm
and
inviting
then they
him.
have
Yeah,
sex,
right, exactly.
rather than her
I do
having
think
some
that
sort of
explicit word changes a lot,
and her to be inwardly titillated that the idea is that guy thinks that he raped me, not
right.
We had
Right.
an encounter. It's her going, he thinks he raped me,
Right,
and that's hot in this context.
Right, it's
like,
not really like a role play where there's like a because like that's fine, like that's normal.
people do things.
People do dominant, submissive role play all the time, but to actually view it as like, a non-consensual act. Anyway, let me read the last sentence here. So, individualist feminist Wendy McElroy said that while Dominique is thoroughly taken, There is nonetheless clear indication, quote, that Dominique both gave consent for and enjoyed the experience. Both Bernstein and McElroy saw the interpretations of feminists such as Brown Miller as based in a false understanding of sexuality, end large quote from Wikipedia.
I'm glad that people are having conversations about things like this.
Yeah, I agree. And that's kind of what I wanted to do here. Like, I didn't want to like gloss over it and be like, anyway, there's rape. Like, I wanted to talk about it a little bit. And yeah, it is challenging. It is problematic. It is kind of tough to parse like what the author intended or what she didn't intend or whether she intended it or not. Is
what
it still
the characters
bad?
are experiencing.
Yeah,
because
exactly.
It's like we don't really get, from what I remember, we don't really get Howard Rourke's perspective on this. We don't get his internal monologue about this. We only get
her POV.
Dominique's.
Yeah, this is during her POV.
So, that adds some complication and maybe some interesting complication because just because Dominique is saying certain words to herself, that doesn't necessarily mean that's what's in the other person's head. Like, it is a rich text. It's just a deeply concerning, troubling one in some ways.
Yeah, and it's a tough thing for readers to get through sometimes,
right.
which understandably.
Right.
Like I've recommended the book to like a lot of my friends over the years.
Right. To your mother?
To my mother. And like when I first read this when I was 17, I think, 18.
Right.
I remember like after I recommended it to a female friend of mine, she read it and she was like, I got to this one part and I think I might have to she ended up finishing the book, but like she's like, I think I might have to stop.
Right.
And it was that scene. And me as a 17-year-old, this is just like me confessing all of my shittiness as like a 17, 18, 22-year-old. But like I was like, what are you talking about?
Right.
And I had read the whole book. So I had apparently even read the part later where Dominique introspects that it was rape. And I was still like, oh, I didn't notice that at all, which is a little bit of a commentary on like what things are presented to us as rape and not rape. Like if you go back and watch like Blade Runner or some things about Raiders of the Lost Ark that really I don't even want to talk about because it's horrible. But there's just things that get presented to the point where like as a 17-year-old boy reading that scene, it literally didn't even occur to me.
I think that's one of the damaging things in portraying sexual encounters like this is that it does normalize certain things. Yeah. It does normalize a lack of consent. It does normalize the idea. And this is so normalized in our society. We don't need to go down this rabbit hole. But like not getting or asking for consent explicitly is like super romanticized in like a lot of our mainstream media. And this is,
Right. And I'm saying this as like can confirm. Right. This was normalized for me to the point where I didn't even know like that. Like to this day, I'm like, that's the person that first informed me about this controversy. I didn't even know. Right. And that's not great. Anyway, putting that very real and very large discussion.
Oh, wait, I want to say one more thing. Sorry, can I say one more thing?
Stuff it in a box. No. Okay, fine, go ahead.
I just want to say, we've said all of the things that make this controversial. I think it's also, there's one thing about like having a nuanced and conflicted conversation about a piece of art. And then when you explicitly have the artist's entire philosophy and set of beliefs summed up very like well documented, including their view of men and women. Right. That makes those conversations a little less nuanced and interesting because they're just really heavily colored by, okay, well, we know what the artist thinks.
Yeah. This scene in context of how she feels about men and women and about gender, it's less good.
It makes it less fun to have a conversation about, and I use fun loosely. Continue.
So back to the very abridged plot summary for The Fountainhead. So Mr. Rourke values artistic integrity to like a caricature extreme, but I don't necessarily say that in like a bad way. Like Rand's works are sort of like comic books in literature form. There's like this really heightened sense of reality going on where like all the characters are like larger than life. Nobody really talks like real people talk. And you just kind of like imagine that like everywhere just sort of looks like the design from BioShock, like level design from BioShock. If it was like maybe utopia instead of dystopia. And by the way, for anyone who's played BioShock, yes, BioShock's setting and characters are explicitly inspired by Rand's works. And if you haven't played BioShock, then what I mean by that is that there's like over the top Art Deco, right? So like that's just when I say heightened settings, heightened characters, like I'm just picturing like Art Deco everywhere and like larger than life comic book characters.
It's austere Great Gatsby dialed up to 11 and stripped of any joy.
Whoa, okay. I don't think it's stripped of joy. No one's doing the Charleston in the Fountainhead. Right, but the joy comes from like weird sort of like,
oh my God, that building looks so good. That
building is so spiritual to me. Like that's the joy in the Fountainhead.
It's not really a happy joy. It's more reverence.
Yeah, I would say that. Anyway, in this heightened context, I'm like kind of okay with how the protagonist ends the story.
Oh my God, I love it.
She's trying to make a point with it.
Yeah.
I don't want
spoilers
to spoil
for the Fountainhead.
Yeah, I don't want to spoil it here, so I won't say any more.
The artist takes his art into his own hands
in a very like extreme way,
and I loved it.
Yes. So the Fountainhead apparently went through 12 publishers saying no before seeing print, and it would have been 13 if an editor involved hadn't threatened to quit over its rejection. Sales were initially slow, but thanks to word of mouth, that editor turned out to be right, as the book eventually did well enough to bring Rand, quote, lasting fame and financial success. Success including a 1949 adaptation on film starring Gary Cooper, for which Rand herself wrote the screenplay, and... Oh, now we're back in Los Angeles.
Wait, hold on one second. I have to say something about this.
Yes.
How old is Gary Cooper? He was like 49 or something.
Oh, yeah,
in the movie.
He was like, and like Rourke's supposed to be like 22 or something.
Was like in his late 40s, and Howard Rourke's supposed to be like 22 when the book starts.
Yeah, so I've watched the movie. It's pretty jarring. Like he's a good actor,
and like he has to be that young. Like it's pretty relevant.
It's important to his character that like he's got the like rebelliousness of youth thing going on. That like Gary Cooper, he does his best. He's a good actor. So anyway, Rand herself wrote the screenplay for this, which means we're back in L.A. Her whole life after moving to America is just like going back and forth between L.A. and New York City. Speaking of which, she moves back to New York again in 1951. So 2 years later, back to New York. And don't worry, she stays there for a while now. The success and influence of the Fountainhead had many downstream effects for Rand, above and beyond just the money. It also earned her admirers and followers. And after she moved back to New York, she started up a little club consisting of these admirers.
See, now it's a cult. Just be successful. Just have your book. Just have your movie. Don't get the groupies. Stop it, stop it, stop it.
At first...
No.
It really was just a bunch of dorks that went to Ayn Rand's apartment once a week and talked about philosophy. Exactly like my club at Penn, actually. We'll get back to these guys, but first, the timeline here warrants that I mention her second big novel, her magnum opus, as it's called, Atlas Shrugged, which some discussions from her dork fan club actually did influence the writing of. So Atlas Shrugged was published in 1957, and the reaction was pretty mixed from critics. Quoting from Wikipedia here, despite many negative reviews, Atlas Shrugged became an international bestseller, but the reaction of intellectuals to the novel discouraged and depressed Rand. Atlas Shrugged was her last completed work of fiction, marking the end of her career as a novelist and the beginning of her role as a popular philosopher.
Wait, I'm sorry. Say that again. Why did she stop writing fiction after Atlas
Shrugged?
Well,
I don't think there's a because there. There's a maybe because.
Oh.
But she didn't... She was depressed by the reaction to it by, like, elites. Like other intellectuals.
I have a lot to say about this.
Well, if you want to say it now, go for it. There's more about her life that we can... I mean, like... We got more text to go through.
I'm going to bite my tongue because I'm just going to be saying some things that I shouldn't be saying.
All right, well, hold that
about
thought.
About my industry and the people that come out of it sometimes.
Don't lose that thought. So back to the philosophy club comprised of the Ayn Rand superfans. Among this group included the following folks. You might recognize one of these names. All right, so there was Nathaniel Brandon and spouse Barbara Brandon. There was Leonard Peikoff, and there was Alan Greenspan.
Why do I know that guy? Fred? Chair Fred?
Yeah, no, that Alan Greenspan. He was part of Ayn Rand's inner circle way back in the day.
And he was the
and then he eventually found his way to being chairman of the Fed.
Why do I know that?
Because he was like, not only was he chairman of the Fed for a while in like the 90s and early 2000s.
I don't know what the Fed is.
He was also like kind of in the news a lot.
What's the Fed?
The Fed is the Federal Reserve Board. It's like think of it as like the national bank.
I refuse to think of it like that.
It's the head finance guy of the country.
Okay.
Does that track?
Good enough for me.
Now, get ready, because the right is starting to get better at comedy, and it's making the left nervous. This group of theirs ironically called themselves...
Unironically or ironically?
Ironically.
Okay.
Ironically called themselves the Collective.
I'm going to throw a bomb at
Get
them.
it? Because they hate collectivism. It's so good.
That's the lamest thing I've ever heard. Good God. We're going to all sit around and talk together in one big group and say that groups are bad.
So we all kind of know Alan Greenspan, so I won't really get into his deal. It's just kind of a whoa moment to be like, oh shit, Alan Greenspan was one of her like inner circle disciples? That's
How old is he?
I don't know how old he was at the time. But the other folks on the list, we'll start with Leonard Peikoff. Peikoff? Peikoff? I'm going to say Peikoff. Now, he was 17 years old when he started hanging out.
Okay, Ayn Rand, I've got to tell you something. Don't be an adult hanging out with 17-year-olds.
Rand had no children, and she became close enough with Mr. Peikoff eventually that she legally designated him as heir to her estate.
That's cool.
He's followed through on that since. He was the co-founder, actually, of the Ayn Rand Institute, the one in Irvine, the one that I got all the free pamphlets and brochures from when I registered my pen club, the one that sent some of those speakers for the lecture series.
Yeah, the teachers did 9/11.
Teachers did 9/11 lecture series, yep. So that's he started or co-founded the Ayn Rand Institute. He's also done a ton of other stuff by now, mostly in the academic sphere, and a bunch of like the free online courses you're able to take at ARI's website feature him as the lecturer.
And who's taking these courses?
I took one.
Yeah, but who else?
Who else? I don't know. People that it's probably like, here's what it probably is. It's probably like you have an annoying friend who's an objectivist and is like, hey man, you got to watch this lecture. Like it'll change your life. It's probably stuff like that. Because I can't imagine how you'd like organically come across this thing, but there's like tons. So I'll get into this here in a second because I do want to take a quick detour before talking about the other folks in the collective. You can take a shit ton of classes on the ARI website, and some are quite long. So as I mentioned, I did a short course one, like just over an hour.
This was your experiential portion?
Yeah. So this is
in addition to like the experience of being in the objectivist realm for many years?
Right. This was my checking the box on the season 5 theme of experientialism. But you're right. I almost feel like I didn't need to check that box since...
You checked that box when you were 20 years old.
I lived it. Yeah. So this class was called Introduction to Objectivism. It was mainly a refresher course for me, but it was also recorded in 1995. So
that is a long time ago.
I just want to show you a picture of Leonard Peikoff's hair from this lecture, but just be warned.
Is it grand?
You are going to want to instantly join the cult after seeing this.
I'm in.
All right, so there's picture number 1.
I'm in. That is the most 90s.
I know.
That's like, you said 1995? My God, he's got pleated Dockers on, and he's got a mullet, curly mullet.
Curly epic mullet. Look, here's a close-up of the curly epic mullet.
Oh my God, he looks so good.
Look at it.
He looks great.
The mullet like flares out at the bottom.
I don't even know how he did that. That guy's definitely a cult leader. There's a cult.
He does kind of have the cult leader glasses.
Yeah, he's a cult.
Speaking of experientialism, it actually is possible, sort of, to visit the Ayn Rand Institute, but it's like just a little office space in an office building in Irvine.
The Ayn Rand Institute makes it sound like it's like a grand campus.
Yeah, that's kind of how I always envisioned it until I found some article that was written by somebody else who had gone to visit, and it was like, it's like when you go to like a doctor's office, and it's like, go to the 3rd floor and it's like down this hall. It's like that kind of thing.
That's not what I pictured at all.
Yeah, me either. I
pictured it in a
like
building,
a sprawling campus with tours and statues.
Yeah, and the building was clearly designed by architect Howard Roark.
Right, exactly. By the way, shout out to season 1, episode 3 with Irvine. As we discussed in last episode, I also reached out to ARI for an interview and they politely declined, although they did send me that other interview between former director Yaron Brook and Michael Shermer, which I might end up referencing again here once or twice.
They responded with, no, and we are not a cult, and here's why.
No, and definitely not a cult.
No, and here's the FAQ on why we're not a cult, a totally normal thing for someone to have.
Back to Mr. Peikoff, though. So my first exposure to Ayn Rand was The Fountainhead, and I think it's safe to say that Atlas Shrugged was my second real exposure.
Which book do you like more?
Oh, The Fountainhead. It's not even close.
Okay.
Atlas Shrugged is interesting. It's interesting, but it is a
Dagny Taggart
it's a mouthful.
is a great name.
Dagny Taggart is a good name.
And
the book is just very big.
I don't know what it means, but who is John Galt? I'm in. I want to know. My interest is piqued.
After those two books, like when you kind of start like Googling stuff, when you start digging more into the Ayn Rand cinematic universe, Peikoff's name obviously comes up thanks to like the Air thing and all of his own work. One of his own works is a book called, quote, The Ominous Parallels, The End of Freedom in America, end quote.
I think you should write a book called My Mom is Ayn Rand.
It's more like Mommy, though, because it's like... All right. So anyway, this was me in my like Rand honeymoon period.
Okay.
And even then I was still like, yeah, I don't think I ever need to read that. That title's absurd. It's like Godwin's Law.
You've always been the same. Like, even when you're different, you've always been the same. You've always been the same.
Yeah. But yeah, it's kind of like Godwin's Law for books, and Godwin's Law is the internet thing saying that as an online discussion grows longer, the probability of comparison to Nazis or Hitler approaches 100%.
Right.
It kind of feels like it's part of that. According to book summaries and reviews, it basically does what it says in the tin. It draws parallels between America's current culture and German culture leading up to the Nazi takeover, and then, surprise, surprise, prescribes objectivism as the cure.
Wait, what is culture he's talking about? What year is this?
I have not read the book, so I don't know, but they have this sense, and I think that this contributes to their feeling of a cult. They sort of have this sense of like, oh, everything is still wrong and only we have the answer to make it right again.
That feels really culty.
Yeah. I do want to kind of self-reflect here. We sit here and say like, what a ridiculous name for a book. But then like, I know that you and I sometimes use the word fasci a lot.
Yeah, we do.
To criticize America. So like,
but see,
is he not just doing the same thing?
Here's the difference.
That we're okay and he's not?
That we're right.
Mullet? We're right, yeah.
I'm objectively correct.
I'm objectively correct. No, it's hard because like, I think there are fascistic elements that we can point to.
Right.
But then I also, like, when I see somebody else do it and go like, oh, that's stupid, then like I kind of have to think about how I do it too.
No, when you said Godwin's Law, I immediately thought about like, yeah, that's everybody does that. That's not, no political belief system has a monopoly on that.
Yeah, so that doesn't mean I don't still think that like the book title is stupid. It just means that like, I don't know.
It can be stupid for other reasons.
Things are complicated.
Yeah. It can be stupid for shut up, you don't know how good you had it.
Yeah, for real. So since I did go through the trouble of watching the entire Intro to Objectivism lecture and Q&A session and took the trouble to take notes, I will talk about a couple of the points he raised that I thought was interesting or at least informative.
Who was he doing this class for in the 90s?
This was like a bunch of college students. I forget where.
Okay.
It might have been UCLA. I'm not sure. So Mr. Peikoff gets asked about liberals and conservatives. And while he says that both sides of the aisle are bad, of course, everybody's bad except for objectivists, right?
Right.
As strange as this continues to sound, he says conservatives are actually worse because they want to control citizens' moral and intellectual lives. And he cites like, criminalizing abortion, prayer in schools, that kind of thing. Whereas liberals want to control citizens' economic lives, which to him, at least in 1995, to him, that was the lesser of two evils.
This is why it's been so weird for me to like, for us, I guess for everybody, to see the rampant uptake of love for Ayn Rand amongst the politically conservative because the viewpoints are not explicitly on that side.
It's odd. And like
they're
objectivists...
they're like, oh, that side's bad and that side's bad. But for some reason...
And not only do they say both sides are bad, they're like, and it's probably, the conservatives are probably worse. Like, that's not every objectivist, but that's like, I would say most of them.
That seems to be the stance of the root source.
Yeah. And Ayn Rand has like had some quotes to that effect as well.
I guess it's just the conservatives really hate welfare. Is it just that?
I guess. I think so. I don't know, man. Like the alliance of the sort of like economic conservatism, neoliberal economics with the religious right is weird. That's worthy of its own like podcast series. Right. So, I think that's why some of these things are like, huh, really? And like objectivists for their part, like really don't care for religion and really don't care for that kind of stuff, like the spiritual stuff. So I think that's why a lot of times like they'll just draw that hard line. But so this kind of ties in, this next point kind of ties into what we were just saying about the like everything's going to shit and only we have the cure. So I think that there's definitely within objectivism, or at least with objectivists, there's definitely a healthy helping of millenarian DNA in them. Right?
Do we live in a fallen society?
Yep. In this lecture, Peikoff talks about, and I'm paraphrasing here, the idea that our civilization is definitely headed toward collapse.
Right.
And of course, only the ideas that we promote can save it, which again is also what his book seems to have been about. I did write down part of his quote here, which is, quote, "Civil war, international war, economic collapse, a new dark ages are all possible," end quote.
What does he think about now? I must know. If this is what he thought about the state of the world in 1995, and granted,
and this was also
obviously
like
there's a lot of shit that was going on in 1995. There's no perfect era.
No.
But I want to know.
But for an objectivist, like we just had the 80s and also the Soviet Union just collapsed. So like, what are you, this is like yours should be at the peak of your game. Like this is exactly what Ayn Rand wanted.
I guess
it was like 1995.
It was still really socially conservative in a lot of ways, and that was bad.
I guess I think that there was also like, if you're viewing both sides as bad, then it's like, yeah, we're still creeping towards, you know, losing right to abortion, and we're still creeping towards all the things that prayer in schools are kind of tied with, you know, like we hadn't quite gotten into the like evolution debate yet, but that was just the next domino after prayer in schools.
Did they have any stance on Roe getting overturned?
I'm not sure officially, but I think that not, like 90% of them would think that that was a bad thing.
Okay.
Don't quote me on that, but I'm pretty sure.
Quoted.
Anyway, millenarianism definitely seems to be present, and maybe even core a little bit to objectivism, because like actually that's kind of what Atlas Shrugged was about. I know you didn't read that one, but Atlas Shrugged was about the creators in society, like stopping, quote unquote, stopping the motor of the world. Okay. Right. So it was about the like essentially like the billionaires. Well, they weren't billionaires at the time. Let's be super clear. It was about the
magnates,
the
tycoons.
The tycoons, the titans of the creative titans of industry, because don't you know, all of the titans of industry got there because like, you know, in her mind, like Elon Musk like invented Tesla type of thing. Right. Like that was the idea.
You guys, he didn't.
So in her mind, it's like those types of people that don't exist. Right. Going on strike. And therefore...
Oh, no! Whatever will we do if Elon Musk went on strike?
When capital goes on strike, oh man, that just ruins everything.
Oh,
but the point is, it's got this millenarian, like, hey, we stopped the motor of the world, quote unquote. Everything's kind of collapsed. Now we're going to go like reset society with good values about money.
I'm going to throw up.
So just seems to me that millenarianism is certainly core to the philosophy. So Peikoff gets into the weird logical loop that we talked on last episode, where someone asks like, well, what about action XYZ? Like this thing that we all agree is bad, like murder or something, right? Like, what if that's in somebody's self-interest? And the answer is inevitably, you know, well, if you look at it in the right way, it's not actually in your self-interest to do the thing XYZ. It's not in your self-interest to murder. Right. Which like kind of seems like a closed logical loop to me, right? If you can always just turn something around to say like this thing that seems like a counter argument is actually an argument in favor. Like, sure, it's probably in my self-interest to not murder someone and steal their money because I'll probably get in trouble for it. Like I get that, but let's be real. Like I think we're all going to agree that it's wrong to murder regardless of whether I eventually get in trouble for it or not. So how does self-interest factor into that? And besides, like, objectivism itself argues that selfishness is further down the philosophical trunk than something like law enforcement. So if you have to invoke like law enforcement and consequences as the thing that makes it wrong, when deeper in the trunk, further towards the base, should be this like ethics of selfishness, then like that's just incredibly flimsy at that point. And to boot, objectivists absolutely think that there are bad laws that are immoral and probably ought to be broken, things like regulations and whatnot. So I just don't get how you can kind of invoke that, like, well, you're probably going to get in trouble, so it's not selfish, really. That
feels like someone missed the class and didn't read up on the part. Like that feels like that's a really big oversight if the collective and Ayn Rand didn't cover a better way to talk about that. Like, if that's the...
Look, I might just be not doing it justice, too, but I've always had this...
It could be that you're really bad and dumb.
I am stupid, so, like, let's factor that in for sure. But we also, we had this conversation in our pen club several times where it was like, you try...
My dream. I want to sit in a room full of 19-year-olds and hear their take on why you shouldn't murder. 19-year-olds at a very prestigious, expensive university.
Okay. We were all like 20, 21, 22. So that's way different. But like, I think that what we're also running into here is the exact thing we talked about last episode is ought problem.
Right.
Like, especially in the philosophy club, you sit there and you kind of go like, all right, we can think of a way to objectively define ethics based on like the laws of physics. And it just doesn't work. It just doesn't seem to work.
Yeah, it kind of feels like with something like murder and some things that the more axiomatic argument for not doing it is that other people are other people and not I must always act in my own self-interest. It does kind of feel like that to me.
And I think that, and this, is I think an argument that a lot of atheists talk about, with regard to ethics and moralism in religion, and to the argument of like, well, how can you possibly do the right thing if you're an atheist because you're not afraid of consequences? Kind of feels like that a little bit too, right? Where like,
yes, that pendulette thing of like,
I feel like you wouldn't murder anyway. Hopefully you feel like murder would be wrong whether or not like you went to hell.
Yeah. Pendulette literally says, I commit as many rapes and murders as I want. That answer is 0.
Right,
that number is 0. And if your answer is something different, like, get the fuck away.
Right. It feels more likely to me that it's like a logical fallacy than like there's a bunch of like Christians walking around just desperate to like rape and murder if it were like if it weren't for their
But Jesus. Yeah, people don't like
it's not that. I think honestly, like my take on it, not to go into another huge rabbit hole, but like my take on it is that it's morality is more something that is hardwired a little bit into us for the purposes of making us able to work as a pro-social species.
I hate to break it to the objectivists, but collectivism is one of the reasons why we are successful as a species. And so maybe there's some things that are hardwired into us.
I agree.
Just like you said, just to like get along and work together.
I think objectivists would say, well, of course we're like built to be social. It's just, what is the proper way of interacting with another human? Is it sacrificing oneself or sacrificing them, or is it free and mutual trade? Like that's how they would kind of answer that. But let me get back to this last point that that Peikoff made. Oh, sorry, two more points. He blamed the increase in crime between the 70s and 80s in America on the quote morally bankrupt 60s culture, end quote.
Always comes back to hating hippies.
I know. Exactly. And like, why does it always also come back to it's the culture, like everybody, moral decay. It's always moral decay. Even when you have a philosophy built around like reason and like science, when you get to the end of it, it's still just like an old white dude going like, it's moral decay and the hippies.
People should behave in their own self-interest and not kowtow to the man. And also, when these guys said, fuck the man, they were wrong and bad.
And it's like the objectivists are anti-Vietnam War, too. So it's like, I don't know.
Like, we can all have problems with the hippies, but what exactly was their problem with the hippies?
Yeah, I don't know. It's just
that they goofed around and looked goofy? Like that.
I think free love or I don't know.
What is that? How's that?
I don't know. That wouldn't be it either. I really don't know because
it just, that sounds like
drugs? I don't know, Kayla.
Okay, you're going to tell me the objectivists aren't like just do whatever drugs you want?
I bet the collective was like doing weed at least.
I don't even mean that. I just mean it feels like, given their standpoints on things, that it should be up to the individual whether or not they want to take drugs, and that's not a moral issue.
I cannot pinpoint it. All I know is that it's weird, but also not weird.
The hippies.
That you have these guys that supposedly like hate religion, but suddenly like at the end of the day, they're still bitching about moral decay.
Oh, I know what it is. It's because the hippies were like doing communes and stuff. Like the hippies there was a collectivist approach in some of their philosophies.
Yeah. I'm certain that factors into it. A few of his Q&A answers reflected the lack of nuance in objectivism that I think really hurts it as a viable philosophy. Everything is absolute. Rand was an absolutist, and so was her philosophy. Only laissez-faire capitalism is good enough capitalism. Several students asked him questions along the lines of, okay, but what about poor people or people who need help? And after some explanation, he punctuates his answer with, quote, "The only logical conclusion of a government that has state welfare is complete totalitarianism," end quote. Again, not a lot of nuance there that, like, exists in the real world.
Right.
And he gave the usual, like, objectivist / libertarian answer about, like, okay, wait, so then poor people just get fucked in this system? And the answer that they usually give, depending on how you look at it, is charity or mutual aid. So his example was that supposedly farmers in the 1800s, before they could count on aid from the federal government, if a farmer was unlucky enough to get struck by disaster, he'd often be richer afterwards, actually, because the whole community around him would come together in support, which actually sounds pretty nice. Not particularly selfish, or, like, I don't know, maybe it is because it implies a social contract involving mutual aid that you might benefit from. I don't know.
Do they know how charity works? Like, do they know? And I'm not saying that that's charity. I'm saying, do they know how charity works?
What do you mean?
Like, they say charity, charity, charity. Are they talking about, like, some nebulous idea of charity, or are they talking about charity as it exists,
nebulous
as
idea.
An entity?
As they tend to do, nebulous idea.
Like, so what are they saying? They're just saying that people will magically get helped by, like, some benevolent billionaire?
They're saying that there's no problem with helping the poor. They just don't think it should be the government doing it, because then
So then who's helping the poor?
People to help the poor.
So what I'm hearing is that the poor will not be helped.
The poor may not be helped.
So they're saying that
they're saying if people
should
don't decide that
die.
They want to help the poor, then the poor shouldn't be helped. That's what they're saying.
Then the poor should die. That's the natural consequence there.
Probably, yes.
I just have a lot of questions involved in a lot of this.
I think the weirder part for me is that, like, they frequently say, like, oh, that's a good thing. And under capitalism, under laissez-faire capitalism, there's less poverty anyway, so it's actually a better system regardless. But that's not the moral basis for capitalism. The moral basis for capitalism is free interaction between two people. And if the government takes taxes from you and uses it to feed the poor, then that's not a free interaction. And a better way to maybe think about it from the devil's advocate perspective is less like, well, I'd rather just hold on to my money, and more like, well, what if you think that the biggest issue is poverty and I think that the biggest issue is healthcare, and somebody else thinks that the biggest issue is helping third world sweatshops or something, right? Like, then why is there an entity that can, like, override what I want to help and help what you, like, let's say the government is like, we're going to spend our money on homelessness. Right. And then I'm like, well, what about the third world, slaves? Like, that fucking sucks. And so I think that that's, like, a stronger argument, because the argument there is, like, who decides what we spend that money on? Wouldn't it be better if we all individually put our money where our mouth was and donated or whatever to our own causes that we care about?
I remember when I was a young person and I thought a lot about taxes. That's all you need to know about me. And I remember being a child and going, well, wouldn't it just make a lot more sense if we could, like, pay the taxes to the things that we cared about? And that way people who, like the military could pay their taxes to the military, and, like, I could grow up and just pay my taxes to, like, schools. I think the Objectivists would have really liked that pitch.
So are you saying that they are childlike in their assessment? Or are you saying that, like, this is actually kind of complicated sometimes? Because I think we've talked about this. It does suck.
I would
to pay taxes.
Love to not pay taxes that go to cops and military.
Right. I mean, like, we are spending, like, the military, like, helicopters and missiles are insanely expensive. Yeah. And a lot of the influence, because we have so much money influencing government, comes from that. And, like, it creates this sort of, like, feedback cycle where we're just sort of, like, stuck in this, like, military industrial complex. So, we've sat here and gone, like, yeah, you know what? Fuck taxes. And then we're like, wait, am I just a libertarian now? What happened?
My problem is that I'm pro taxes and I'm anti the things our government chooses to prioritize. I view the government as something that should be, like, the will of the people that it represents. And currently our taxes are generally not distributed in such a way.
Right. Right.
But also, you can't do certain things just via charity alone. Right. And I am totally on their side in saying that we could better organize our society to produce or to create less poverty, to create fewer people that need help, need charity, need aid. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. We absolutely could organize our society to create less poverty. And we're choosing not to do it. But in the meantime, I don't want the people that are in poverty right now because we have a fucked up system to like die on the street. Right. And so I kind of think until like you got to do something to save those people. Right. You do. Sorry. Bye.
So again, this stuff is like kind of complicated, right? Because it's like on one hand, you're like, what? They're crazy. No, taxes are good. But then like when you think about it from a different perspective, you can kind of see what they're saying.
Oh, fuck taxes. Also, yay taxes.
Yeah. All right. So let's go back down the tangent tree. We just talked a bit about the Leonard Peikoff lecture that I watched for these episodes. Before we get back to the other folks in Rand's inner circle, the collective, here's a few courses that I didn't take. And I do mean a few because, again, there are a shit ton of these courses on the ARI website. By the way, I noticed some of them are not free. Some of them you do actually have to register and pay for. And some of them are actually like not lectures that are, just like from 1995. Some of them are actually like ongoing classes. So there's like some things that are just lectures and some things that are like an actual course.
Okay, gotcha.
So here's some names. Certainty and Happiness. Achieving Success in Thought and Action. 2 hours.
I've got to say one thing about that.
Okay.
I'm not happy.
Okay, great. Maybe you should take that class.
I don't get a lot of communication from Ayn Rand's work about how to be a happy person.
Oh, I feel like that's, well,
but that's
we'll get
me.
to that. She
me.
Does happiness and like fulfillment are kind of like, that's why we got to be selfish.
Okay.
Next one, lectures on culture and politics, 6 hours. Logic, the method of reason, 6 hours. Moral virtue, 6 hours. And then there's a bunch of lectures on Rand's books, of course. There's one called The Art of Thinking, 14 hours.
The Art of Thinking.
Free Will, 3 hours. 8 Great Plays, 33 hours.
What?
8 Great Plays.
Is hers one of them?
Actually, no. I did click in. There is actually kind of a variety. The only one I remember is Othello, and then 7 others.
It is pretty great.
There is a course on CRT, obviously.
Critical race theory?
Which actually does have some interesting titled subtopics, but like I don't trust it at all.
Nor I.
Like anybody who even says those letters, I'm just like, I don't trust anything you're about to say. But anyway, the list goes on. Again, like they kind of, the point of me selecting those particular titles is that they cover like everything.
Yeah.
Right? Logic, moral virtue, happiness, culture, politics, Rand's books, other plays, free will, art of thinking. Like it just covers everything. And that's why there's so many courses. I guess that's just the nature of having a complete philosophical system. I don't know.
Yeah, that's a lot.
Anyway, continuing back down the tangent tree, let us go ahead and talk about some of the other folks in the collective. So we talked about Peikoff, Greenspan. We didn't really talk about him actually because he was already famous. And the other folks I mentioned in that initial inner circle were the Brandons, Nathaniel and Barbara. Nathaniel Brandon, he started out as Nathaniel Blumenthal. And after marrying girlfriend Barbara, which was a few years after they started hanging out with Ayn, they changed their last names to Brandon. Brandon. Coincidence?
Oh.
I didn't dig into this to see whether like he explicitly acknowledged that he changed his name like to Rand, basically, Brandon, or whether it's just like speculation. Like I kind of want to give them the benefit of the doubt and just be like, oh, it's cool that you guys chose a different last name for both of you.
Right.
But they did change their last name when they got married. Anyway, Nathaniel came into the inner circle at 20 years of age.
Why were they all so young and small?
Well, in 1950, after reading The Fountainhead, becoming enraptured, and exchanging fan mail with Ayn Rand, he ended up joining the group. He sent her a fan letter, they corresponded, And then he moved with Barbara across the country to go, like, become part of her, like, collective. Pretty wild.
See, this is a reason why we shouldn't have this stage of capitalism that we're in, is because you used to be able to do crazy shit.
I know. It makes me
You could just move across the country. You could just be...
I know.
You could have a fucking mansion for your commune house. Like,
and you could email... You could just send a message to, like, a famous person. You could email Ayn Rand from the future, or send her regular mail, and she'd be like, hey, man, what's up?
Well, now you can tweet at Chris Pratt.
That's true. And it makes me bummed, though, because, like, my fan mail to Shannon Miller when I was 16 never got me anywhere with her.
Did you actually send it?
I think so.
Because you have a copy of it at home. You won't let me read it.
Because it's too embarrassing, Kayla. But apparently it's possible that, like, that can work. I don't know. So I'm just bummed about that. Anyway, Mr. Brandon quickly became Rand's favorite little guy, which led to her naming him as her heir.
Wait, what?
What?
You already said that she had an heir, and it was her other favorite little guy.
Oh, we already talked about Rand's actual legal heir, Leonard Peikoff, you mean?
Yes.
Oh, that's true. And, like, the law of identity states that A is A, and a thing can't be true at the same time in the same way for two different things. So how is this possible?
Explain.
We will get to that, my friend.
I need to know now.
Back to her relationship with Mr. Brandon. Here's what Encyclopedia Britannica has to say. Quote, among members of the collective, Nathaniel Brandon was unquestionably Rand's favorite. She openly acknowledged him as her intellectual heir and formally designated him as such in the afterword of Atlas Shrugged, which she co-dedicated to him and to O'Connor, end quote.
Who's O'Connor?
O'Connor, if you don't remember from much earlier, was Ayn Rand's husband.
Ah.
So she co-dedicated Atlas Shrugged to Nathaniel Brandon and her husband.
What's going on here?
Thoughts?
What's going on here? I don't know. I think there's a lot going on. I think that how old was she at this time? I think there's something weird about hanging out with little kids.
She was...
They're not little kids. 17 and 20 are not little kids, but...
She was born in 1905. So in 1950, 51-ish, which is I think when this started, she was like 46, but this continued into the 60s.
Okay. I think that I'm looking at these ages with a little bit of a side eye.
Little side eye.
Just because I'm not saying like, she was a groomer. I'm just saying there's, anytime you have those disparity in ages in some sort of like mentorship, leadership, charismatic leader capacity, there's like...
Where there's like a heavy degree of like admiration.
There's an imbalance of power.
Yep.
So it makes me concerned. And then also I'm just like, what's going on? What's happening?
Yeah.
Tell me what's happening. Tell me what to think.
I think that's pretty astute. It feels very much like that to me as well, where again, you have this like, because I mean, the power dynamic here is real, right? Like this is a fan.
Right.
I mean, it was a fan. Now it's like, it became much more than that, but it's a fan, 20 years old. Ayn Rand is 45 or whatever, in her 40s, and is like this world renowned at this point, I think, for producing the Fountainhead.
Right.
So, she's working with like Cecil B. DeMille and with Gary Cooper. So there's definitely like a Father Yod thing here where like you have this like glowing figure that's like way above you in terms of their, position and power.
Right.
Definitely feels like
right.
that.
And for some reason his favorite little guys in his team were a bunch of young people, a bunch of young women.
Right.
There was anybody of all walks of age and life in his group, but his favorites were the young sycophants. And so I'm just looking at Ayn Rand and you're telling me that her favorites were the young sycophants, and I just have questions.
After Atlas Shrugged was published in 1957, with a bunch of input from Mr. Brandon, I might add, Rand gave him her blessing to start a company with the objective to promote objectivism. Let me read you just a bit more from that Britannica article on this, which I think does a great job of summarizing this period of time in Rand's life. Quote, in the late 1950s, with Rand's permission, Brandon established a business designed to teach the basic principles of objectivism to sympathetic readers of Rand's novels. The Nathaniel Brandon Institute, NBI as it was later called, offered courses in objectivism in New York and distributed tape-recorded lectures by Brandon to objectivist centers in various other cities. Despite its outward appearance as an educational institution, NBI did not permit its students to think critically about objectivism or to develop objectivist ideas in novel ways. Through the success of NBI, Brandon would eventually become the public guardian of objectivist orthodoxy against innovation or unauthorized borrowing by objectivist sympathizers, especially among the growing student right. In 1962, Brandon and Rand launched the monthly Objectivist newsletter, renamed The Objectivist, in 1966. Meanwhile, Rand's fame grew apace with the brisk sales of her novels. She was invited to speak at numerous colleges and universities and was interviewed on television talk shows and on the news program 60 Minutes. End quote.
So we got dueling orgs or dueling...
No, this is with her blessing. This is part like this.
But I'm
is,
saying, but
this is
I don't
like,
understand. You said there were 2 heirs. How are there 2 heirs?
Oh, we haven't gotten to that part
I'm
yet.
confused.
All right, so there's right now in the story and there's right now in real life.
Okay.
So right now, as of in 2023, it's Leonard Peikoff.
Okay.
At this point in the story, in the 50s and 60s, it's still Brandon.
Okay.
And there's at some point that flips over.
And can you tell me why?
So we will still get to that, but I do want to discuss real quick like the sort of like dogmatic orthodoxy part here, because this clearly refers to that, right? Like at this point in time, it says Brandon would become the public guardian of objectivist orthodoxy against innovation or unauthorized borrowing.
Gotcha.
So again, it feels rather dogmatic in that regard. I also, though, I want to present like a counter argument to that I heard Yaron Brook make in his interview with Michael Shermer. So like his thing was basically like, look, Ayn Rand invented something. She invented objectivism, and she wanted the thing that she said was objectivism to be objectivism.
Right.
She's not saying you can't go have other thoughts and do other things. That just can't be called objectivism.
Right. It's a different thing. I'm not anti that.
I'm not anti that either. I think it just... I don't know. It just, there's part of it that feels weird.
Feels weird that that's such a priority. The preservation rather than like
the
interest in philosophical thought and like some sort of give and take. But that again kind of goes back to this like idea of, well, this is mine and I made it. This is what I say. There's no outside influence. It's not a conversation. This is what I'm saying. Right.
And that feels weird to me for like a philosophical system, especially one that's like being actively promoted by an institution.
Right.
Versus like, I wrote a book and I don't want you to change the words.
There's something different between like, an artistic endeavor and a philosophical endeavor.
Yeah. And what I've but I think that it's like, they're not like that Venn diagram certainly overlaps.
Yeah.
I think
like I can't just get up and say like, oh, well, Aristotle said this and this is what we should take from Aristotle. I mean, I can say that,
right? But
I can't say dogs go to church on Wednesdays and that's what Aristotle said and it's Aristotelian philosophical beliefs. I can't do that.
Are you saying that dogs don't go to church on Wednesdays?
I don't think they do. I think that they're a Thursday church-going crowd.
Dogs, I know. It's like the twice-a-year dog Catholics. Anyway, where I've landed on it is like, I actually think that the person that it hurts the most to be orthodox is Rand herself or ARI themselves. Because like, you can say it's not open for like discussion or change or evolution. And that is absolutely you're right. You have every right to say that. But then like as soon as you say that, it becomes like tremendously less useful. Yeah. And you encourage people to say like, well, I'm going to pick and choose some stuff. And if those people that pick and choose stuff, if you like don't have dialogue with them because they're not saying it the right way or whatever, then what do you even do? Like you're only shooting yourself in the foot, I feel like.
Right.
Anyway, let's get back to Miss Rand. So here we are, 50s, 60s. Things are going great, right?
I mean, I guess.
She's flying high. She's got the book sales going.
What
She's
happened?
got her
Did something happen?
Intellectual air going. But like the Greek tragedies that objectivists recommend, that heady flight up to the sun sometimes leads to something of a fall. So is there anything else, Kayla, that you think that like feels weird about Ayn Rand's relationship with Mr. Brandon?
I will answer your question by asking you a question.
Yeah.
I'm a writer.
Yeah.
If I wrote something.
Yeah.
And then I dedicated it to you.
Yeah.
And my 20-year-old male
protégé.
Sycophant, how would that make you feel?
I wouldn't feel super great about it.
Would you at least, like,
I would
it would probably raise some
on.
concerns. Even if you believed the relationship to be totally academic or platonic or whatever, you would at least go, it's interesting that and I'm putting words in your mouth, I'll phrase this as a question. Would you at least go, I find it interesting and raises some red flags for me that my wife would put me and this guy on the same level in like her magnum opus?
Well, first of all, I don't think you've dedicated any of your scripts to me. So
no, I have not.
I'm already like, I'm a bad person to ask because I don't know who you're dedicating them to, what little 20-year-old you have running around.
All my 20-year-old friends.
Are your little hottie 20-year-old sycophants? I know.
Got a lot of those.
So Nathaniel and Ayn had indeed been having a sexual affair.
Yeah, I would have thought so.
Lasting roughly 10 years.
That's a long time.
And this affair was the most Ayn Rand thing.
I don't want to hear about it.
That you can possibly describe.
See, is it very serious?
Well,
it just feels like everything is so fucking serious with these guys.
I know.
That's what I mean about like the lack of joy is that
it's
because
exhausting.
Even when you're talking about like happiness, it's not like woohoo. It's like serious.
Right. It's like, I am very happy and reverent right now. I am fulfilled ideal man. Okay. So the following is a paraphrase from Barbara Brandon, later writing on this topic, Barbara being Nathaniel's wife at the time. She wrote a bio memoir called The Passion of Ayn Rand, which was also made into a movie with Helen Mirren playing Rand, no less.
Okay, I want to watch this.
So we need to like watch that for the
Hot
show.
Ayn Rand?
I know. But this is a paraphrase from that memoir, and it's actually secondhand from Shermer's Is It a Cult essay. But, quote, the falling in love was not planned, but it was ultimately, quote, reasonable, since the two of them were, de facto, the two greatest humans on the planet. By the total logic, this is a quote again from Rand, quote, by the total logic of who we are, by the total logic of what love and sex mean, we had to love each other, Rand told Barbara Brandon and her own husband, Frank O'Connor. It was a classic display of a brilliant mind intellectualizing a purely emotional response, and another example of reason carried to absurd heights. Whatever the two of you may be feeling, Rand rationalized, I know your intelligence. I know you recognize the rationality of what we feel for each other, and that you hold no value higher than reason. This is her speaking to Barbara and Frank. Unbelievably, both Barbara and Frank accepted the affair and agreed to allow Ayn and Nathaniel an afternoon and evening of sex and love once a week. And so, Barbara explained, we all careened towards disaster. The, quote, rational justification and its consequences continued year after year as the tale of interpersonal and group deceit grew broader and deeper, end quote.
Look, man. People can have all different kinds of relationships in all different kinds of ways, and I am not going to sit here and judge anybody for having different kinds of arrangements with their various friends and lovers and committed partners. That being said, I'm genuinely horrified by that level of like gaslighting and manipulation coming out of her mouth.
But I think she believed it, though, is the thing. Like,
I don't care. That doesn't make it not gaslighting and manipulation.
No, I know that. But like, this is definitely like a drink her own Kool-Aid thing, because I've definitely read other quotes from her where she's talking to someone about like the affair. Maybe it's Brandon, maybe it's Barbara, I don't know who, but like I've definitely read quotes where she's like, this is right, because like there's definitely the same thing going on with this affair that goes on with the philosophy itself, which is like, well, this is okay because it is derived from the facts of reality, and it's like objectively correct because we are the two most like important people on the planet, and of course we would, fall in love with each other, and so therefore you guys should be totally okay with it, which in like some weird sort of gaslighty way I don't know if they were okay with it, but they allowed it.
Well, it's like they
permitted it.
Clearly you have to let them do this or else you lose them.
Yeah.
And it's just horrifying to I don't think that you should think you're the most important person on the planet. Like, are they saying that in a like, I'm more important than other people because I'm making this philosophy, or we are the most important people on the planet in the way that any individual is the most important person in their own world?
I mean, like, I think that Ayn Rand definitely had an inflated opinion of herself.
I also think that maybe don't get married if you're Ayn. I'm serious. If you're Ayn Rand and you hold your philosophies to such a close degree that you seem to live your entire life, every action of your life is defined by this philosophy, it does feel like getting married is incompatible with that. I mean, if you don't want your selfishness to also be injurious, then I don't know if you can get married and not be immoral.
Yeah, but Kayla, in her philosophy, it shouldn't have been injurious because Frank and Barbara should have looked at it and gone like, oh yeah, they are two like titans of like intellectual thought, and that makes sense. So I'm not even upset.
Okay, well, how would you feel, if if I was saying, look, man, I gotta fuck this guy because he and I are the most important people on the planet. Why are you even married then?
Because it's logically justified by the facts of reality.
But like, why stay married to this schmuck over here? Like, why not just get married to the most important? If he's the most important person on the planet, what are you getting from your husband? I don't understand.
I don't know. And obviously, I'm the most important person on the planet, so I don't know what she was thinking with this Brandon guy. But anyway, this is something
you weren't alive at the time.
Well, doesn't mean it wasn't important back then. Right? I was going to be alive. Somebody could have predicted that.
Literally, that is, whether or not she believes it, that sentiment is like so overlapping with so many things thought and believed by so many other cult leaders.
Other cult leaders, yeah.
Like Father Yoda would absolutely say something like, you don't understand. We have to be having an affair because we are like... we're on a soul bonded, must be together, twin flames universe.
Right, and I am like literally maybe God on earth, so like I'm doing you a favor when you have sex with me. Like, do you remember that lady that was interviewed on that documentary about David Koresh and the Branch Davidians?
Yeah.
Do you remember how she talked about having sex with
Having
David Koresh?
sex with him was being close to God.
It was being close to God.
It was
and
worship. It was prayer.
Was deigning to have sex with her, and she felt so grateful.
Right.
That this godlike being would have sex with her. Now, I don't think Ayn Rand is quite at that level, of course, but it's like the same type of thing, right? Where it's like, well, I mean, of course you want to have sex with me because right. I'm the biggest brain of all time, right? So like, of course I'm kind of doing it a favor for
calm down for a second. Like most people, all of these people we talk about, like if they just took a breather, if they just went, wait, hold on, time out. Let me take a step back. It might help a lot of things. Because just calm down.
As you mentioned before, at this point in time, there's also an age differential. I think when they started it up, Ayn was 49 and Nathaniel was 24, half her age, which, I don't know, 24 is kind of getting to the point where it's like whatever, but it is half is a lot. I don't know. It's a beige
It's also
flag.
a lot
it's
to be like, this
flag.
is the most important person on the planet, this 24-year-old. Like,
right.
I'm sorry.
Right.
I felt very important 24. Our 24-year-olds are incredibly important. But to be 49 and saying this is like an intellectual titan that is the most important person in the world is maybe discounting the importance of like wisdom on intellect.
Maybe he just had like really awesome tits.
Maybe.
Yeah. So their affair eventually did trail off. According to him, she became somewhat depressed after Atlas Shrugged was published in 1957, and then like that kind of just naturally ended things, sort of.
It's not super hot when your book doesn't do well.
Yeah, so it was, I don't think anybody knows like exactly when they started boning, but they met in 1950, so like a maximum of 7 years, but probably a few less. I know I said 10 earlier, but that was like that was more the time period, excuse me. So maximum 7 years that they could have been actually boning.
Okay.
By the way, can you imagine how intolerably cringe their sex must have been?
No!
Not to like sex shame or kink shame or anything. Like whatever kink you're into is cool. It's just funny to think about like their particular kink.
I'm so important. I'm so important.
This is the most rational sex I've ever had.
Oh my God.
This fulfills my veneration for your ideal man and culminates with my philosophy. I'm coming. Selfish. Coming.
Stop.
A few years later, Rand did try to resume the affair with him.
Aw, she loved him.
But by that time, he was already on to his next affair with a younger model named Patricia Scott.
Oh, no.
So he was uninterested.
So he was just cheating on his wife because he liked to cheat on his wife.
So this new affair was finally the nail in the coffin with his marriage with Barbara. So they got separated.
Good job, Barbara.
Even at that time, both Barbara and Nathaniel agreed, let's not tell Ayn about this because she's going to go apeshit.
There's problems here.
Yeah,
that's a problematic thing to happen.
Probably seemed wise at the time, but, and this goes to what you're saying about problematic, lies do incur a debt to the truth. And in 1968, Ayn Rand did indeed find out about Nathaniel's relationship with Patricia from Barbara herself, who apparently changed her mind.
Barbara. Get it. I like that.
And I really want to watch The Passion of Ayn Rand now. And that revelation finally led to the fall of objectivist Olympus. This all transpired pretty differently depending on who you want to believe, whether you want to believe like the Brandons themselves and their memoirs and interviews, or whether you want to believe Peikoff and ARI, which basically like totally dismiss their point of view, or the spectrum of her followers and other objectivists who range from believing the Brandons' accounts all the way to defending her to the point of like infallibility, which is the vibe I get from ARI. In the interest of trying to be objective about this, I did trace through sourcing on the Wikipedia and Encyclopedia Britannica articles on this subject. And while the two Brandons accounts are cited in both places and I think contribute like a lot to this tale, there are also plenty of other primary sources from which the articles draw information, which is important. Like so as a side note, in the interview with Michael Shermer, your own Brooke basically like dismissed some of the like culty claims from the Brandons, saying like, oh, well, you know, that's one source. Okay. And it's a biased source. Like, I'm not saying that all of what they're saying is like incorrect, but like there's
the parts I don't like.
There's motivation there. So you can't necessarily treat that as like the only source, but I don't think it is the only source, at least based on me tracing where these encyclopedia articles took their various bits of information. There were other bios, other memoirs written, and you know, letters from Ayn Rand, blah blah blah, that they're citing as their sources. So it's not just the Brandons. So here's some accounts of what went on. First, the wiki articles on Ayn Rand and Nathaniel Brandon. Quote, she published an article in the Object. So this is after, by the way, after finding out about this affair that had been going on for a while, and she hadn't been having her affair with Brandon for like 8 years or something.
Girl.
Quote, she published an article in The Objectivist repudiating Nathaniel Brandon for dishonesty and other, quote, irrational behavior in his private life, end quote.
I can't listen to any more of this.
In subsequent years...
I can't. I can't do this.
In subsequent years, Rand and several more of her closest associates parted company, end quote. Why can't? Why not? Does this make you not like the Fountainhead more? Is this like...
No, I've already got plenty of reason to not like it. It's fine. It's just
like how you can't watch Annie Hall now?
Upsetting. This dynamic is just so upsetting and awful.
But isn't it juicy, though?
Oh, it's extraordinarily juicy.
It's the juiciest thing.
It would be better if it weren't like, you know, a charismatic leader...
It would be, but...
orchestrating and manipulating their sycophants that are much younger than them.
Yes, I cannot agree more.
But... just, you guys, all of you are so predictable.
Yeah, I know.
So tropey.
It's so tropey.
Oh, he had an affair with
juicy.
A hot young model instead of you, and then you did.
And then this is the best part, is that it's like he's
irrational in his personal life, and therefore he must be repudiated.
It ties so closely to her like way of thinking and philosophy or whatever. It's like if this were like a video game, like we'd call it ludonarrative design. Right. We call it ludonarrative cohesion. I just love the cohesion between like how the affair happened and like how her fucking books are. Because in her books, by the way, like you know this from Fountainhead maybe, but in Atlas Shrugged, Dagny Taggart, like she's going through guys,
right? And
she's going through like the world's best guys. Like she's going through like first she dates this steel magnate, and then she dates this like generations like mining guy from
she's
like South America.
She's a railroad magnate, right?
Yeah, she's a railroad magnate herself. And then at the end, of course, she dates John Galt. So she's just like going through all the, like the best guys in the entire world.
And I also gotta say, this guy is getting y'all.
I don't know. He might have been cute.
I'm not saying he's not, but I'm just saying, like, you're writing your books about Dagny Taggart dating John Galt, and then you're like, I like Brandon.
And I like this 24-year-old.
Like, it's not even like Andrew Carnegie or somebody. You know, it's not like a Kennedy.
Yes.
He's not a Kennedy.
But he has the key thing that ultimately I think she wanted.
He can pull models.
Which is he was absolutely enthralled by her.
Right.
And her philosophy.
And then the second he does something that shows he can be enthralled by another, that's very completely threatening.
Shatters it.
Yeah. God, it sucks,
even if you haven't been in an affair for 8 years.
Right.
And the Brandon Wiki article quote says, in response, Rand morally condemned the Brandons and disassociated herself from them in an article for her journal, The Objectivist, which, without revealing the existence of her romantic involvement with Brandon...
Oh, but he's dishonest.
She's
not irrationally dishonest.
Accused him of deliberate deception and financial misdealings in their business partnership.
Okay.
End quote. Now let's hear from Botanica. Accusing him of betraying objectivist principles, she stripped him of his partnership in The Objectivist and demanded that he surrender control of NBI, which was soon dissolved. The closing of the Institute freed various self-described objectivists to publicly develop their own interpretations of Rand's philosophy, all of which, however, she rejected as perversions or plagiarism of her ideas. She was especially incensed at the use of objectivist vocabulary by young libertarians, whom she accused of disregarding morality and flirting with anarchism. Meanwhile, Brandon's status as Rand's favorite disciple was assumed by Leonard Peikoff, an original member of the collective whom she would eventually designate as her intellectual and legal heir.
How does it feel to be sloppy seconds, Leonard? I want to say one thing.
I wish that I could ask him, but he's got the hair, so maybe
his hair is pretty great. I like that it's not that she's incensed that he would be with another woman because he was married to another woman.
Right.
It's that he would have an affair with another woman.
Right. Yeah.
And I guess, that would make you crazy if it's like you thought. And
especially
because it's like somebody having, I could see the twisted logic of like, oh, somebody having an affair with you that makes you special in some way. But if he just has affairs, you're not special.
And also they kept it secret. Right. So there's definitely like a chicken egg there of like, well, why didn't you tell me this? It's like, because we knew you'd react this way. Right. Well, I'm only reacting this way because you didn't tell me.
Right.
But there's definitely some aspect of that, I think, going on. Let's go back to the Skeptic article by Mr. Shermer because he calls together some of my favorite tidbits. In this first quote here, he'll be giving Barbara's account of how Ayn Rand took the news that Nathaniel was having an affair with someone other than her. According to Barbara, Ayn said, quote, "Get that bastard down here."
Okay, I love her. I love her again.
Rand screamed upon hearing the news, "Or I'll drag him here myself."
I'm back on board.
Nathaniel, according to Barbara, slunk into Rand's apartment to face the judgment day. "It's finished, your whole act," she told him. "I'll tear down your facade as I built it up. I'll denounce you publicly. I'll destroy you as I created you. I don't even care what it does to me. You won't have the career I gave you, or the name, or the wealth, or the prestige. You'll have nothing." The barrage continued on for several minutes until she pronounced her final curse. "If you have an ounce of morality left in you, an ounce of psychological health, you'll be impotent for the next 20 years. End quote. So that's an account from Barbara. Okay. Did it happen? I don't know. I like to think that it did because it's pretty cool.
Don't people realize how goofy they are? Like, come on.
Let me read this last bit because the Skeptic article also pulls from Rand's public response, which, while less juicy and fun than "Get that bastard down here," is equally damning for the way in which she frames everything. In a 6-page open letter to her followers in the publication The Objectivist, May 1968, Rand writes, quote, "About 2 months ago, Mr. Brandon presented me with a written statement which was so irrational and so offensive to me that I had to break my personal association with him." And then he says, without so much as a hint of the nature of the offense, Rand continued, "About 2 months later, Mr. Brandon suddenly confessed that Mr. Brandon had been..." This is her writing. Oh, sorry. "About 2 months later, Mrs. Brandon suddenly confessed that Mr. Brandon had been concealing from me certain ugly actions and irrational behavior in his private life, which was grossly contradictory to objectivist morality."
I really am. It's honestly, it's causing fear in my body, the way that she's using the word irrational. It's really scary and
she continues,
not good.
"Because Nathaniel Brandon and Barbara Brandon, in a series of actions, have betrayed fundamental principles of objectivism."
Like not fucking me.
"We condemn and repudiate these two persons irrevocably and have terminated all association with them." End quote.
Very rational. Very logical.
So you can see kind of the, like, problem here.
Oh!
Where
there's a problem here?
There's a massive conflation happening between, like, what she thinks is objective, what she thinks is part of the philosophy, how she conducts her own life, what is actually objective versus subjective. Again, these last bits are from the Brandons themselves, so maybe a biased source, but, well, actually the last thing that I read was from Ayn Rand herself.
That was Miss Rand.
So that was, that was her saying, not, I was upset that he was fucking someone else. That was her saying, like, he's betrayed the principles and is thus excommunicated.
That's so culty and terrifying. That's so, like, that is an unsafe exit, my friend.
It is very unsafe. Anyway, thus ended the relationship between Ayn Rand and the Brandons.
I feel really bad for Leonard Peikoff right now. I really do.
I know. I've always felt bad for him.
So bad for him.
I know, dude. I know.
This is the most important man in my life. I guess maybe it's this guy.
And also, like, it kind of makes me, like, it recolors all of, like, the dedication that he's had to, like, promoting these ideals. It's kind of like, well, of course you're dedicated. Like, you have to prove this out. You have to prove out that you were the correct heir.
Yeah.
Right? You have to be the most dedicated and, like,
and
protect the orthodoxy.
And if you step out of line, Ayn Rand's going to come back from the dead and, like, repudiate you.
Right.
Because of your lack of rationality.
So Nathaniel went on to become a clinical psychologist and the, quote, father of the self-esteem movement.
Okay. What does that mean?
He wrote, like, a bunch of books. He published a bunch of books about, like, self-esteem, and, like, that was part of his practice.
What's his name? Nathaniel Branden?
Nathaniel Branden, yeah. So I think for the most part, it's, like, kind of how we were talking about, like, it can be healthy to have, like, to treat, to choose yourself first.
Right.
I think that's kind of where he went with it a bit. I know that he disagreed on principle. Like, at first he was like orthodoxy guy, but then he started disagreeing with things. One of them was like the place of emotion. Like, he felt like emotion had a much higher place in human conceptualizing of the world and making sense of things than Rand did. Like, with Ayn Rand, it's like, oh, I guess emotion's there. Whereas he was like, no, it's important. Anyway, as for Miss Rand, after the dissolution of the Collective and NBI, she kept publishing, although intermittently, with a bi-weekly newsletter and a collection of philosophy articles that she wrote, but she was never quite the same, and by this point was getting to kind of be up there in age as well. Also, she was a ravenous smoker, and because she was Ayn Rand, it had to be like a thing. It couldn't just be like, oh, she smoked. It was like a moral thing. Like,
shut the fuck up.
Smoking is this spiritually fulfilling thing to do as an ideal human. Or there's like this whole passage about it in Atlas Shrugged about, like, it makes me think I can control fire, or what it makes me.
I think that she should have literally taken a trip to Sedona and just got a little sound bath and just maybe had a little edible and just chilled out for a second.
So yeah, this, like, ideal human smokes, but on the other hand, she had to undergo surgery for lung cancer in 1974.
But it's morally the correct position. And I hate it. I hate all of this because I hate all of this. I hate it. I hate it. I think that artists that are super serious and take themselves super seriously are extraordinarily compelling. I could not be more compelled by somebody like Marina Abramovich.
I was just going to say Marina Abramovich.
Marina Abramovich could come out and say smoking is a moral imperative because it is man's control over fire. And I would go, fuck yeah, it is. You fucking better believe it. I will follow you anywhere. But if Ayn Rand comes out and says that, I go, chill out, lady.
What a weirdo.
You should just chill.
So in 1976, she retired from writing her newsletter and, after initial objections, allowed a social worker employed by her attorney to enroll her in Social Security and Medicare.
Oh, Ayn.
Finally, in March of 1982...
This is the only thing I really know about Ayn Rand's, like, life.
We'll talk about it in a sec after I tie the bow. Because she died in 1982 of heart failure at her home in New York. And at her funeral, a 6-foot floral arrangement in the shape of a $sign was placed near her casket. And in her will, she named, of course, Leonard Peikoff as her heir. And as we've mentioned, for his part, he really did do quite a good job of carrying on her legacy. Like, he co-founded the Ayn Rand Institute that we've mentioned several times.
Look, man,
he does all those online classes, advocacy. It's all of its involvement in college clubs.
He's the real hero of this story.
I know. If it weren't for the ominous parallels, I would have been a Peikoff fan instead of a Rand fan.
Like, yeah, here's the thing. Like, as a character, I'm really digging him.
Yeah.
As a human being, jury's out. Right. But as a character
in the
I'm on
story
his side.
and the passion of Ayn Rand. Yeah. Do you want to talk at all about the Social Security thing?
I mean, I was just going to say that that's the only thing. That's one of the few things that I know about her personal life. I didn't know, obviously, all these juicy bits. I just did know about what is often labeled by Ayn Rand detractors as like the hypocrisy of speaking of building an entire moral framework around if you need welfare, like go die, and then needing and relying on it in later life. And I know that there are supporters that say like, look, man, that was money that was stolen from her in the form of taxes. So she was just using her own money. And to that, I want to say, how do you think welfare works? That is how welfare works. Welfare is generally you pay into it and then you get it back. Like when I go on unemployment insurance in between jobs, I'm not just taking money from somebody else. I've paid into that.
I think part of the problem is that like everybody always thinks, yeah, but what if I never have to pay into something like that? Or what if I never need health insurance? What if I never need that?
Then you are God.
Right. But that's what I'm saying is like, you always think about that. You always think that way if you're thinking that way.
Right.
Until something happens.
Well, look,
and then it's
Ayn Rand
like, this is different.
Yeah.
Right?
Ayn Rand.
It's the same way with abortions. Right?
Yeah.
It's like, well, it's, it's not those people. It's people that are just using it as contraception. And then like something happens where like for health reasons and, because you have like a corpse in your uterus, you have to like get an abortion in month 7 or whatever. And then you're like, well, but it's not that. Right. It's the other people.
It's the other people.
So
I think that it's possible that detractors perch on this gotcha maybe a little bit too much. And also, I will say that it is definitely a very blatant, like, come on, you guys. Very blatant, like, okay, you're going to hold certain people to a certain standard, but the charismatic leader is okay for doing this. Got it.
Yeah,
the charismatic
I will
leader
give her credit.
Cannot be... there's no way for the charismatic leader to do a wrong. Yeah,
and that kind of feels like that's true with Ayn Rand, especially for ARI, like the orthodoxy people. Because I might mention this later, but like nothing in their stuff about the Brandons or about any other like schismy type stuff. Nothing.
Ooh, that would get people in. That's getting people in the door.
I know. When I finally learned that, which was like well after I had read both of her novels, and I finally did the Googles, right?
Right.
I was like, whoa, that's interesting.
Yeah.
That's
the sexy stuff.
I wouldn't have thought that. I get why that is sort of suppressed, because that does call into question like the hypocrisy, as I said this at the top of the show, doesn't always walk the walk.
Right. Yeah.
So
and
yeah,
in some
I will also say
terrifying ways. Like it's really, it's not just being like misusing the word irrational or logical or whatever. It's like utilizing the like keywords of your philosophical framework in order to condemn somebody who's not fucking you.
Right. And I'll say about the Social Security thing, like I think another counter argument to that is like, you'll see like, reverse the tables there, right? And like people on our side of the left-right divide, people will be critical of people who are like in favor of socialism or pro-communism or whatever. They'll say like, oh yeah, you're typing that on your iPhone and tweeting it on Twitter, both private companies.
Right.
Like, and I think that's like, I don't know. I don't care for that either, because like we all have to live in a society. And so I think that's part of it with Ayn Rand here. Like you can kind of say like,
make the argument.
You do have to, at the end of the day, you do have to take Social Security to live.
Right.
Your ideology doesn't really compute with this.
Right, exactly. But that said, get wrecked, Ayn Rand, for taking Social Security at the end of your life.
So objectivism, as it stands today, is like, well, the inner circle, the collective, is long gone, of course. Died before its charismatic leader did. But objectivism itself is more popular than ever, with all those Tea Party types and other right-wing nincompoops. Like, so there's that. And ARI does seem to be alive and well. They have a ton of material on their website, and they still have these guys writing like op-eds and lecturing and whatnot. And there's also more objectivists out there than just the ARI orthodoxy.
Okay.
One notable example is the Atlas Society, or TAS, which was founded by objectivist David Kelly. Although there's like a little more juicy internecine drama here as well. So in the late 80s, he was with ARI himself. He was part of the organization. But then, here's how TS's wiki article describes the situation. After disputes with ARI founder Leonard Peikoff and board chairman Peter Schwartz, ARI cut ties with Kelly and warned others in the objectivist movement not to associate with him. In response, Kelly and former ARI advisor George Walsh co-founded the Institute for Objectivist Studies in 1990. It was later renamed the Atlas Society, which is still around today, by the way. TAS positions itself as a more open and tolerant alternative to the orthodox ARI. ARI and TAS are the most prominent American organizations advocating for objectivism, although TAS is smaller and not as well funded as its rival.
TAS sounds like a better time.
Yeah, and I just love that it's like the whole excommunication thing, like history repeated itself.
Right.
The son acts like the mother.
Yep.
And also we know that objectivism has really made it because why?
There's a schism.
Schism, baby. Yeah. So, yeah, I can confirm that ARI in particular doesn't really do any acknowledging of TAS. And they also don't really talk about Brandon either or anything else that might pierce the veil. David Kelly, for his part, allegedly that dispute was related to the orthodoxy itself. Like he wanted to promote the idea that objectivism was an open system.
Okay.
Which Peikoff and by extension the rest of ARI was explicitly against, calling it a closed system, which we talked about before is what Ayn Rand herself wanted. Well, Kayla, that brings us to the end of our episode. Life and times of our charismatic leader, complete with the juicy, dirty laundry. Thoughts?
I have a lot of them.
I wish that our audience could see your face right now. You're like, your head's cocked to one side.
I'm doing a rock eyebrow. I think that...
I think that I want to watch Passion of Ayn Rand.
I want to watch Passion of Ayn Rand right now. We're going to go watch Fast 9, but now we're going to go watch Passion of Ayn Rand. I think that I have far more data points on certain aspects of our criteria than I did before. I will reserve total judgment until we get to the end of this journey, but I'm a little more disappointed in Ayn Rand the person now than I was before, and unfortunately I think that trend is going to continue because I know that in future episodes you're going to get into more specifics on like positions that were maybe held and statements that were maybe made about certain things from her. Yeah. So I'm not looking forward to I already was like not, a fan of Ayn Rand the person, and this is not really helping.
Yeah, we're going to play a game called Good Take, Bad Take with Ayn Rand.
Okay. Okay. I think that I maybe know what I'm going to call this at the end.
Well, yeah. No spoilers, but I think that, I get it. After hearing that and knowing that, like, we're not exactly going to be, like, redeeming in the next episode. Like, all the redemption was actually, like, last episode where I was like, there's some good stuff.
There was some redemption here, though, in this episode of talking about, and granted, I don't think that she or her club would call it redemption, but explaining that there were some personal circumstances that Ayn Rand experienced as a young person that shaped her worldview. I think that that's important context. Like, I think it's really important context for people, especially who may not really agree with, where she ended up philosophically, to at least know that it didn't come out of a vacuum and it didn't come out of growing up in America. These are not like, obviously she had, she liked America and she wanted to come here and she wanted to live here. And, her philosophies are very intrinsically tied to a lot of like American philosophies. But her viewpoints grew out of living under a political system that, took something away, I'm going to use vague terms here and not try to use judgment terms, took something away from her family, changed the way her family operated in their home country, forced, moving around and eventually separated her from her family. Right. So those are very specific experiences that were probably negative that came out of...
Oh, they were very negative in her... I mean, like she said, like she might have, might have starved several times.
Starving is not good. And if a collectivist, if you perceive a collectivist culture as leading to you and your family's starvation, it makes sense that you would swing the other way on the pendulum a little bit.
Right. And I'll give, I would like to say, like, I don't even know if I'd use the word perceived there. Like, I mean, it was the Bolsheviks at that point that did the nationalization.
Right.
So that's not to say that there aren't also bad things that happen in capitalism. But certainly, like, I don't think what happened to her family was a good thing. And there is a clear, like, chain of causality back to the Bolshevik government.
Right.
Also, 1917, like, no matter who wins that, it's probably going to be rough on some people.
Right.
When there's a revolution.
Right.
Right. So, like, maybe it would have been
kind of by definition
a different family if the Bolsheviks had lost. I don't know. But certainly, you know, in our world, they didn't. And that had its negative consequences on her. And
well, that's often a trend.
Led to her thinking certain ways.
That's often a wider trend in communist revolution and in communism in general when it comes to a country, is that often our thoughts on communism in America are shaped by the fact that the people that communism harms the most tend to leave and then immigrate here.
Right.
So, and that's something that's explicitly happened with Ayn Rand. Her particular family was harmed by this thing, and that brought her here. And we see that a lot with, like, detractors of Cuban communism. We see that with lots and lots and lots of different ways. So it's just interesting context and useful context.
One more little bit of context, too. Sort of, I don't know how important this is. I read it in one place that she, to finish the deadline for the Fountainhead, had, like, took, like, a bunch of, like, stimulants. I forget exactly what drug it was. But
this is what I'm saying. They would be down with drug use.
Yeah, well, she was. She was definitely down with productivity drug use. And in this particular thing that I read, alleged that, like, some people thought that maybe that's why she was a little bit volatile later in life with her, like, get that bastard down here and that kind of thing. So
I think it was I
don't know, just throwing that extra
I think it
context.
was the power.
Yeah, I do too.
I think power does corrupt. I just don't want to come to that conclusion, but I'm coming to it.
Yeah, I think power and then, like, being, like, irrationally rational, I think also.
Well, if you think that you're, like, the best person in the entire world, then that's akin to being like, well, I'm Jesus Christ, so.
Right. So to recap our first episode on this topic, 2 weeks ago, we talked about the orthodoxy that is objectivist beliefs. Today, we talked about Ayn Rand, her life, and some of her key associates. Next time on Cult or Just Weird, in our third and final episode on this topic, we'll go more into how the larger popular and cultural reaction to her writings went down, including this podcast's own reaction as to whether it's a cult or not. Until then, I wish you reason and objectivity expressed in your own unique way. This is Chris.
This is Kayla.
And this has been Cult or Just Weird, Collective Edition.